right, good morning. This is the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission. It is January 31st, and this is our business agenda. We will start with a roll call.
Thank you. Commissioner Ackerman,
Here.
Commissioner Cross,
Present.
Commissioner McGowan,
Here.
Commissioner Mesner,
Here.
Commissioner Oath,
Here.
Commissioner Ray,
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 of 7 commissioners present.
Great to have 7 of 7. Good to see everybody. A lot of business this morning. We will roll right into it. We start with commissioner comments. Does any commissioner have comments for the rest of us and our stakeholders who are listening in? As of now, we have 55 participants. Good to have folks with us. Seeing no commissioner comments, we move to public comment. Hold on. I know I printed it off. I've got it. Colt Caravaggio signed up for general public comment.
Mr. Chair,
Do we have him?
we currently do not seem to have him in the attendees list. I will let you know if he appears, but we were also confirming whether he wished to speak now or later on during the hearing when we have another public comment. But I will keep you updated if he does appear in our attendees list.
Very good. So what we'll do on public comment is we will leave it open. We're not closing it, and we'll see if Mr. Colt, who I can't pronounce his last name, appears with us here shortly. Moving to consent agenda. Does anyone have questions with regard to consent? Do we have a motion to approve consent?
So moved. Second.
Motion and a second to approve consent. Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Consent agenda passes. We now move to a staff presentation on the CCS safety study. Mike Rigby, our geothermal underground natural gas storage and CCS programs coordinator, is ready to present. Good morning, Michael.
Morning. How's everyone doing? Let's see if I can share my screen. Are you all seeing my screen?
We see it. Looks good.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate the time this morning. I wanted to start by thanking Commissioner Cross for the help and input on this study and other ongoing studies. We appreciate the input. Additionally, I wanted to recognize a few people before I get going from the ECMC that have done a lot of work on this project. Mark Seeley, our CCS lead, he played an important role in helping manage this project and really editing and writing some of the sections as well. Then I wanted to also thank Alex X and Elise Devine for their, what I would say, extraordinary effort on this. They led the research and writing on this project. Additionally, they worked hard to kind of insert all of the contractor work that supplemented this project into a final report that we'll be releasing tomorrow. So I think they did really great work here, and we're lucky to have them here. So thanks, Alex and Elise. So I'm here to talk about the study we're releasing tomorrow. It's titled Carbon Capture and Storage, Safety and Impact Considerations from Source to Sequestration. To give a little background information, SB 2316 directed the ECMC to conduct a study generally on CCS operations, looking at Class 6 well safety, pipeline safety, how to limit releases from sequestration facilities, and in particular, the evaluation of potential air quality impacts of capture technologies at point sources, as well as pipeline safety considerations, including modeling of leaks, looking at Class 6 well safety and protocols, and then really looking at the subsurface containment, looking at the reservoir and plume stabilization, and ultimately leading to recommendations for safety measures to protect communities. So let's kind of start kind of basic high level. carbon capture and sequestration, what is it? It's a set of technologies and processes designed to minimize or eliminate releases of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, particularly from industrial sources, although it can be directly from the air when you're talking about direct air capture. So we have capturing CO2 from a source. If the well can't be co-located with the source, which is usually not the case, it must be transported to the injection site, and then it's permanently stored underground through a wellbore. So let's start at the source. And there's some different technology in the capture part of CO2. There's a lot ongoing in this space, a lot of research and development. There's some different things to consider, and it's going to vary on site by site. There's going to be very site-specific considerations when really evaluating capture and what technology applies. But there's some factors on where and when it's captured, and then how it's captured. So where and when, there's before you combust the fuel, there's after you combust the fuel, and then there's combusting the fuel in an oxygen-rich environment. So pre-combustion, you might think of steam methane reforming, where you take methane and you split the CO2 off, and hydrogen, you use the hydrogen, you capture the CO2. There's post-combustion, which is what many of you might think about more naturally in this process, where you're capturing from like a flue gas stream from an industrial facility or something like that. And oxy-combustion is just a specific strategy that would use an oxygen-rich environment to burn the fuel, and it allows for an increased amount of CO2 to be captured. So, and that's specifically viable in maybe certain situations. And then it's how is the CO2 captured? And again, there's a lot of work being done here and a lot of variations, but here's some of the main ones kind of going on today. There's absorption, where the CO2 is bonded or absorbed into a capture media. You maybe have heard amine-based capture. That falls under this category. There's adsorption, where the CO2 is trapped on the surface of an absorbent while other gases pass through. So absorption kind of bonds and absorbs it. Adsorption, it's on the surface of the material. There's then a membrane that uses a permeable material that selectively allows the CO2 to pass through and be captured. A little different strategy that is kind of more up and coming is cryogenic, where it cools the gas until the CO2 changes to a liquid or a solid, and the CO2 can then be removed and separated from the other parts of the gas stream. This last one is called calcium looping, and it's essentially a chemical reaction that takes the CO2, reacts it with calcium oxide to create calcium carbonate, and then that's further processed to create a pure stream of CO2. So there's a lot of different strategies to do this, and it's going to be very site specific on what you do. So as part of this study, as I mentioned earlier, we had to look at air quality impacts at point source facilities if they were to install carbon capture. So, and that is nearing completion. And some of the big takeaways are removing CO2, especially from hard to abate industries, could very well help Colorado meet its climate goals as we move forward. And a big point here is some capture systems require additional cleanup of emissions for effectiveness. So without the cleanup, it would actually be a detriment to the type of capture technology. And some of this can include SO2, particulate matter, and NOx. So a big takeaway here is generally that when you're removing co-pollutants in addition to carbon dioxide, it can positively impact the local air quality. And as I said, this portion of the modeling we are just finishing up, and once it's complete in the next couple of weeks, it'll be incorporated to the overall study that's being released tomorrow. And this will inform and estimate potential co-benefits of installing carbon capture at select Colorado facilities. So we've kind of talked about the source, and now let's, if you're not co-locating a well at a source, you have to transport it. So when transporting CO2 from source to storage site, pipelines are the safest and most viable option in almost all cases. So CO2 pipelines are regulated here in Colorado by PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Material and Safety Administration. And for CO2, it's typically transported as a supercritical fluid. If you don't know what that is, that's basically a dense fluid that has some properties of both gas and liquid. And this falls under hazardous liquid transportation regulations under PHMSA. These regulations have comprehensive requirements in place to ensure safety of CO2 transport via pipeline. And some of these include material requirements, such as chrome casing is a specific type of thing that's, or sorry, chrome, or sorry, that's for the wellbore, but material requirements, corrosion control, leak detection, emergency response, and an integrity management program. And I'd like to just focus on the integrity management program. I think that's a really key part of the regulatory requirements. It's a holistic look at the entire project in the pipeline and how to maintain integrity, prevent leaks, prevent impacts, and it's really integral to the safety of these pipelines. So as part of this study, we also had a review of previous incidents of CO2 pipelines and kind of looked at them in relation to other hazardous liquid transportation. There are over 5,000 miles of existing CO2 pipelines in the US, and they've been transporting CO2 for several decades. So there is a bit of data out there, and generally speaking, they display CO2 anyway. Pipelines display a lower rate of failure compared to pipelines carrying other hazardous liquids. And when there is a release, the releases are generally less impactful in terms of injuries, fatalities, amounts spilled, and total costs compared to other PHMSA-related pipelines. And for CO2 pipelines in particular, the most common by far type of incident is a leak. Leaks account for 85% of reported incidents. And this would entail something like pinhole leaks or cracks, and with not significant impact. So as part of this study I mentioned, we also were looking at pipeline sensitivity analysis, which is kind of modeling the impact factors in the event of a release. So the purpose was to identify what different factors have the greatest influence on the dispersion of CO2 in the rare case of a rupture event. And when doing dispersion modeling for pipelines, there's a lot of factors that typically go into it. Some of the most prevalent factors are wind speed, air and ground temperature, the slope of the terrain, and the pressure and volume of the line. So the monitoring results we ran over 16,000 rupture scenarios. And really what this is showing is that volume and pressure have the greatest impact on the dispersion distance of CO2 during a rupture event. And maybe this is intuitive, but you don't know this for sure until you run the models. But what this is showing is that the volume and pressure of the line have the most positive or negative impact on the resulting dispersion event. Wind speed also plays a pretty significant role, and some of these other factors have a lesser impact. And I think this is an interesting result and something to consider as we kind of move forward here in Colorado. So we've talked about the source. We have talked about a little bit about the transportation, and now we're kind of moving to the wellbore. And there are some siting considerations to kind of talk through initially before diving into kind of the wellbore safety. And as we know, the ECMC has developed comprehensive regulations for the industry it regulates and helps reduce risks to safety and impacts to sensitive receptors. And really, this approach will serve as a basis for our CCS regulations. Further, the law 2316 has a few different siting requirements, and I'll note that these siting requirements, I believe, are more stringent than pretty much any state in the entire nation. So it'll first prohibit Class 6 wells within 2,000 foot of a residence, school, or commercial building. It also we're charged with avoiding impacts and minimizing them or mitigating. And then additionally, any Class 6 permit that will have a negative net cumulative impact on a DI community must be denied. So beyond these regulatory considerations for siting, there are some additional non-regulatory considerations that may be done by the operator. One of the most important is distance from source to suitable storage target. The main point here is that the storage target is you can't store CO2 everywhere. There are specific criteria that make a reservoir a suitable target, and lots of characterization that goes into it. Point sources are where they are. You're not going to move them. And there's going to be a distance potentially between those two. Other things to consider are property rights, surface property rights, subsurface ownership, as well as some of the surface impacts of the well and the ongoing monitoring equipment. There will be a well pad and there is monitoring equipment on the surface to really monitor both the well and the plume in the subsurface. So all of these the big takeaway is there are quite a few considerations when locating a Class 6 well, and not every single location is going to be suitable. And there's specific criteria to make a site a suitable target. So moving into the Class 6 regulatory requirements, and this is where we're going to really come in here in the future as we move forward. But all Class 6 projects require a permit from the EPA or a state with primacy. They require extensive data collection. Some of these permits coming in other states are even up to 1,000-page documents. They're not small endeavors and require a lot of effort and work to put together. But extensive data collection, subsurface evaluation, reservoir modeling, well construction specifications, and really different plans that address various aspects of the geologic storage project, including financial assurance plans, emergency remedial response plans, monitoring plans, and others. And then throughout the life of the well, continuous monitoring is required to ensure well safety, track the plume movement, identify any pressure changes, and to prevent any potential leaks or risks to underground sources of drinking water within the project area. Further, regulations ensure the proper abandonment of wells, including wells that aren't the injection wells that are in the area, and the injection wells at the end of the project. It also requires monitoring after injection has ceased until the CO2 plume has stabilized. Additionally, operators must demonstrate a large amount of financial responsibility throughout the project life, and it encompasses an emergency remedial response, well plugging, corrective action, and a few other things. So kind of going more in particular to kind of safety considerations for well bores. Wells must be constructed to be compatible with injection and reservoir fluids, capable of withstanding anticipated pressures, temperatures, and stresses throughout the project life. And just like with oil and gas wells, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, is there's various barriers, including casing, tubing, packers, and cement incorporated into well construction. And in particular, in this case, anything that's interacting with the CO2 will likely need to have some sort of like chrome aspect to it to prevent any sort of corrosion. So there are specific material requirements to ensure that they're designed for the life of the project. Additionally, there's pressure tests, surveys, and logs that are useful for evaluating the integrity, as we have experience in what we do here regulating oil and gas well bores, and these are required kind of throughout the project as well. In addition, wells are equipped with safety shutoff systems that are designed to automatically stop injection if some preset limits on variables like pressure, flow rate, or temperature are exceeded. So we've kind of talked about the source, the transport, the well. Now let's talk a bit about the reservoir in the subsurface. So from the beginning, from permitting and throughout the entire life of the project, extensive data collection and modeling are required. Refining the model is required. So even to get the permit, it must be thoroughly proven that the reservoir is suitable. Throughout the project, ongoing monitoring and data collection are used to update and refine the model and make it more accurate over time. And really to track the actual plume evolution and movement. And then an important point is site closure, which we can think of as plugging and abandoning the facility. It's only granted when plume stabilization can be proven and there's no risk to USDWs. And this is typically, at least in models and in some of the initial projects, something that can happen over the scale of decades. So site closure is typically not approved or won't be approved for decades after injection has stopped. So kind of diving into the actual rock to talk about a little bit more about what's actually keeping the CO2 in place down there. There's main trapping mechanisms that operate at different time scales that immobilize the CO2 in the subsurface. So the one we're probably most familiar with in the oil and gas realm is structural trapping, where oil and gas gets structurally trapped and produced. The same kind of idea is an impermeable layer will trap the CO2, and this is really in place from the get-go and part of the characterization of the reservoir from the beginning. Some of these others are a little less intuitive. There's dissolution trapping, which is where the CO2 dissolves into the formation fluid and saturates the formation fluid and does account for a significant percentage of CO2 trapped. There is residual trapping, which you can kind of think of if you look down here on the bottom right. It is essentially where bits of the CO2 get kind of trapped by capillary forces within the fluid and around the grains of the rock. And then the last one, which really is the one that likely takes the longest to kind of kick in, is mineralization. So the CO2 can react with the rock and the formation fluid to actually precipitate out a solid mineral. It could precipitate out around different grains. It works over maybe several decades, although it is very variable based on the formation fluid and the rock you're injecting into. But it can clog the pores, but also at the same time is trapping the CO2 within the chemical that's precipitated. So we've talked kind of about from source all the way to the storage site and into the reservoir. And I think it's important to kind of bring up other geologic and natural hazards. And most importantly, the one that comes up a lot is induced seismicity. Initial evidence suggests that supercritical CO2 is less likely to cause induced seismicity than similar volumes of pressures of injected wastewater that come from, let's say, class 2 wellbores that the ECMC has decades of experience regulating. We have existing rules in place to prevent induced seismicity, and I think our experience here and regulations here can be utilized, updated, adjusted to apply to class 6 wells. Further, federal requirements require seismic evaluations for all permits. So prior to even allowing injection to occur, there's a seismic evaluation, understanding if there are already faults, any risks that could be for induced seismicity. And there is the allowance for continuous seismic monitoring for these projects as needed. So mitigation strategies, it can be lowering injection pressures or volumes. They can be deployed in response to any kind of seismic activity in the area. And the main point here with induced seismicity is with proper site characterization of the project area and mitigation strategies in place, induced seismicity should not be a major hazard. Some other hazards that come up sometimes in Colorado are swelling, collapsible soils, extreme weather, and land movement. And these really don't pose any additional or unique threat to CCS installation or pipelines beyond anything else that we do here in Colorado, putting in a house or anything like that. So nothing unique for the CCS industry there. So kind of moving on to considerations for safety for communities. Colorado's Class 6 regulations must be at least as stringent as the EPA's regulations in order for the state to gain primacy. And incorporating SB 16 siting requirements will make them more stringent than the federal regulations, just as a baseline. Further, CCS projects in the state must also comply with the Clean Air Act and oversight by the AQCDC. And just to kind of point out, as I've kind of briefly discussed, and the report goes into much more detail, there's safety regulations that govern the transport, injection, and ultimate sequestration of the CO2, kind of all along the chain there. And then moving on to kind of environmental justice and considerations for communities, Colorado prioritizes the environmental justice, and the state law requires the protection of DI communities and the administration of all of these projects. Further, once the ECMC gains primacy, all proposed Class 6 wells must be evaluated for cumulative impacts, and permits must be denied if there is a net negative impact on a DI community. And just to kind of, I think community engagement is essential to these projects in ensuring safety and success of these projects. And I think the operators play a role here, but the state also plays a role, and continued engagement, continued discussion is really important, and really to help understanding all of the different risks, benefits to all of these projects. So kind of moving forward, in pursuit of primacy, we have to conduct a rulemaking before we can even apply to primacy, and we will be doing that later this year. And they will be at least as stringent as the federal regulations, and even more so when incorporating those siting considerations, as I talked about earlier. Additionally, a full legal framework for ownership and utilization of the pore space is necessary, as well as a mechanism for aggregating property rights, such as unitization. And these are important topics that we are looking into moving forward with. Further, there's the potential for state-based inspection and regulation of CO2 pipelines. It's an important consideration, as all CO2 pipelines, for the most part, are regulated at the federal level right now. And this will be included in or addressed in a study from the ECMC and PUC that is due at the end of the year. And then just from a staff perspective, we really recommend continued communication, development of educational materials by the state and the operators to inform the public and the impacted communities of all the potential benefits and risks associated with these projects as they move forward here in the state. So that's really a quick overview of a large document that'll be released tomorrow. And I really appreciate your time and happy to take any questions as necessary.
Just one quick follow-up, Mike. I really appreciate the great presentation and summary. It was well done and is very helpful to inform the public about the study that we were required to do by the legislature. I think I heard you correctly that there's going to be an addition or kind of a follow-up within a few weeks on that. Could you go just capture that point one real quick?
Sorry, what was the last thing you said?
About the follow-up. There are going to be some additional items that are going to be input into the study that you're still working on. Is that right?
Yeah, so the modeling portion of the air quality impacts at capture facilities, we are just getting some final feedback and incorporating some additional data points into that model. It's not simple to model these things and project these things out. So we are nearing completion, nearly have the results, and that portion will be supplemented and inserted into the greater document within the next week or two, I would say, and would be posted following that. So in a couple weeks is likely to have it posted on the website. The version posted tomorrow will have everything but that air quality modeling, which would be in what would be chapter 2 in that document.
Okay, thank you for that. And then if you could swing back to slide 6 for me.
Sure.
And this just is a kind of a follow-up on pipeline safety. You started with the pipelines are the safest and most viable option, but then if you slide over to slide 9, there's this reference to 16,000 rupture scenarios generated. That's not 16,000 leaks, is it? But that's just a model?
No, these are models. We ran a bunch of model scenarios and they're fictional scenarios. They're not reality scenarios. But we ran this many rupture scenarios to really fine tune the variables that have the greatest impact in the rare case of a rupture event. So rupture events are very rare. Small minor leaks are by far the largest category of releases. But we were looking at, in the rare case of a rupture event, what are the variables that have the most impact on the resulting dispersion of the CO2?
Okay.
And
Thank you
with
very much.
modeling, it takes running lots of scenarios.
Okay, thank you for those clarifications. Commissioners, Mr. Rigby is up for questions from you as well. I see we've got Director Murphy as well. Do folks have questions? And you can pull down the slideshow if you want, Mike, and that way we can see each other better.
Sure.
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rigby. That's a lot of information in there, and I appreciate you trying to summarize it for us. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot more discussion about it. I think you were talking about this in your slides, but I'm not 100% sure. The infrastructure that you have to set up in order to capture the carbon, does it have emissions, and is there a trade-off for the thing that you are setting up and the facility that you're running? If it has emissions, what is the offset for the emissions that it's capturing? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
Sure. So, and I think some of this will come out in the rest of our modeling
Okay.
that we put out in a couple weeks. But generally speaking, it's very site-specific, technology-specific, and it's hard to really speak details without a specific site in mind. But can there be some additional emissions from the capture equipment itself? Depending on the scenario, potentially yes. Typically, from what I've seen in the modeling, the emissions that are offset by putting the capture material on the facility are much greater than the emissions from the capture equipment itself. That said, some scenarios would and capture scenarios do not have any emissions. So it's going to vary site by site. There might be some small situations where capture equipment could increase certain emissions, but the offsets of capturing and cleaning up the flue gas are much greater typically in those situations. But for instance, at ethanol plants, for one, there's really capturing the CO2, there's really no emissions. So it really varies on site, facility, type of capture technology used. And there's a ton of research and development going on here. So it's going to change by the day almost on because there's improvements being made as we speak, basically.
Okay, thanks. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. I think you're also trying to get at one in the slides, the different ways that the carbon's being captured and it adheres to other things or it gets trapped. Do we have enough experience with storing carbon underground to know that it won't somehow leak or escape, and then all that work that you did to try to capture it in the first place is for naught because it's now leaking back into the atmosphere?
From my knowledge, all existing sequestration projects operating in the world, there hasn't been a significant leak out of a reservoir. So there's a lot of work that goes into characterizing the seals above these injection targets to make sure they're impermeable. And then there is extensive monitoring and modeling ongoing to really track the exact actual movement of the plume in the subsurface and to ensure that it really goes nowhere except that injection zone. I have not seen an actual example of an ongoing sequestration project that has had a leak come out of the injection zone or to the surface or anything like that.
Thank you. I'm sure I'll have more questions as we move forward. It's just a lot to absorb. Thank you.
Commissioner Oath?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for that really great presentation. And just building on Commissioner McGowan's first question. So it sounds like it may vary based on the technology and the site and circumstances. So from an accounting standpoint, is there ways to measure that? Are there assumptions that need to be made, generalized across? Like how do we approach that? Are we thinking about that?
I think that's a very good consideration, and unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to think about it, it is going to be site specific, and it's likely going to need to have site specific considerations for understanding how to collect the proper data to account for it. So like I said, some situations it's very clear there's no additional emissions and you can account for what's being removed. If there is a certain type of technology being used, that there are certain emissions. Like I said, from what I've seen, the additional emissions associated with actual capture technology are pretty minimal compared to what is cleaned up. And many times, like I said, a source facility is not going to pick a capture technology that would add pollutants if possible. So it is going to be site-specific discussions with the source facility and the particular technology applicable at that source facility within that project. So it's not going to be a general blanket. It's going to be a site-specific evaluation.
Thanks.
Further questions? Commissioner Cross?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rigby, for the presentation. I just want to, no questions. I just want to say thank you to Mr. Rigby and the staff working on not just this study, but all of them. I know this one particularly had a short timeline and turnaround, and it's one of, I believe, 8 different studies that we have going on as required by the legislature that will be coming up in the next year or so. And so I just really appreciate all the hard work being done on this as we look at additional issues such as CCS and hydrogen and geothermal activities that have either been put under our purview or maybe put under our purview. So thank you for the hard work.
Thanks, Commissioner Cross.
Further questions? All right, seeing no further questions, Mr. Rigby or Director Murphy, can one of you inform the public where they might find the study on our website?
We are refining that as far as I know, but it will be posted tomorrow, and we can definitely communicate the location of the study tomorrow in the release, and it will be in a very accessible place. And we plan on also having the executive summary provided in Spanish. So,
Okay, great. Deputy Director Larson, did you have some input on that question?
Yeah, so we will make sure to have the study listed under our news and notices on the main page of our website. And we do also have a geothermal page on our website, and under the news and notices, we will link to that geothermal page. And as Mr. Rigby noted, it will be easily accessible through a link, the report itself.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks to the ECMC team for the work here. Pleased to get this done, and I'm sure that all of us are looking forward to reading the full study as well as the executive summary. We will make sure that it gets placed into the commissioner's inboxes, and we might schedule a follow-up if we have any further questions with you, Mr. Rigby. Thank you very much.
thanks for having me.
All right, let's return to public comment, which we skipped over. I do believe that our public commenter has been located, and we're going to get him elevated to the panel.
Mr. Chair, Colt has been elevated. He will just need to unmute and he can begin his public comment. Hello, Colt. There we go. I believe you've unmuted now. You should be able to speak.
Hi, good morning, commissioners. My name is Colt Carvalho, and I am a Western Slope resident. My comment today is about the staff draft for the cumulative impacts rulemaking. As an outdoor enthusiast, I highly value clean air. As a brother to someone with asthma, I've witnessed the consequences of polluted air firsthand. And as a father of a young child, I will refuse to sit back while the kids continue to be exposed to unhealthy pollution. I'm speaking to you all today because without clean air for my child, my brother, myself, and our state cannot thrive. I would like to thank the ECMC for working towards addressing cumulative impacts for oil and gas operations. I think it's critical you think about these impacts in terms of how they each add onto one another and how much more of a negative impact that accumulation can lead to, especially when it comes to disproportionately impacted communities who continue to bear the worst impacts of pollution and climate change. After reading the proposed staff draft, It seems to me that the rules fail to establish processes to effectively address the nitrogen oxide pollution, which is a key contributor to ozone. What steps will be taken to strengthen the consultation with the Air Quality Control Commission, set emission thresholds, and link permit approval to meet these standards? How will you ensure the regulations are effectively endorsed and violators held accountable? What specific mechanisms are in place to monitor compliance and address further concerns about cumulative impacts? I feel strongly that all the Coloradans deserve a healthy environment, clean air, and protection from oil and gas pollution that impacts our health, our communities, and our climate. It is of utmost importance that the ECMC and other regulatory agencies look at the combined impacts of all oil and gas pollution sources, regardless of size, so that all are accounted for and addressed. I hope ECMC can seize this opportunity to work with and for our communities and address our concerns in a collaborative and effective manner. Thank you all for your time and consideration.
Thank you very much for the public comment. Hearings Manager Thomas, do we have any other public commenters at this time?
We have one more that was scheduled to go before the Red Hawk OGDP, but they have let us know that they would like to go now because of a conflict in time. So I will elevate Barbara Mills-Bria for that public comment now, just so that we can give her a chance to speak.
Very good. And I think since her comment is directed to the Red Hawk matter, we should make sure that the Red Hawk folks are listening in. I assume they are. Usually their attorneys are. I think it's Ms. Jost. So Ms. Jost, just be aware you should listen in. Okay, Ms. Barbara Mills-Bria, you are recognized.
All right, and I assume you can hear me, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so the commission today, as you just described, is taking up the oil and gas development plan for Red Hawk Petroleum, which is a subsidiary of Pedevco Corporation, a Houston-based company. Another subsidiary of Pedevco is Ridgeway, Arizona, which recently struck a very questionable deal with New Mexico. Under the terms of this deal, New Mexico bears responsibility of plugging 299 non-producing oil wells, which could cost $30 million if it doesn't cost more than $100,000 per well to do the plugging. Then Ridgeway, Arizona will pay New Mexico $30,000 a month until this bill is paid. It could take nearly 83 years for Ridgeway, Arizona to pay for the wells to be plugged. Good deal for Ridgeway, Arizona and Pedevco Corporation, bad deal for New Mexico. Now the same company is asking for you to approve an OGDP to operate in Colorado. Seriously, that would not be good for Colorado given the history in New Mexico and the unfortunate financial assurance rulemaking Colorado recently underwent. Colorado already has enough orphan wells on our hands, and it seems to be acquiring quite a few more since the federal tax money became available. The number of orphan wells jumped from 236 in 2021 to 528 in 2022 and remains at 467. This is all according to your annual reports on the orphan well program. In the meantime, the amount of money from bonds, which has been approximately $400,000 since 2018, dropped to $274,000 in 2023. Not to worry, though, the federal money infusion is almost $7 million. Where have all these additional orphaned wells come from? Is Colorado now offering questionable operators help by taking over the responsibility for the wells the operators should have plugged themselves? Remember that federal money is also taxpayer money. In addition, the question still remains unanswered as to who's responsible once a well has been plugged. It's common knowledge that wells must be replugged every 30 years or so, and Colorado has certainly experienced the need for replugging. I'd be glad to send the data that I found in your annual reports from the COGCC, now the ECMC. Thank you.
Thank you very much for participating with us this morning, Ms. Mills-Bria. We appreciate it. All right, that concludes public comment at this point in time. I think it would probably be helpful to take a short break before we go into the next agenda item, commissioner feedback on proposed cumulative impact rules. It's 9:46. Let's return at 9:56 and give everybody a chance to fill up their coffee cups. All right, welcome back. This is the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission, January 30th business agenda. Now on our agenda, it is time for commissioner feedback on proposed cumulative impact rules. Commissioners, we had staff, this has been an iterative process. And the spot that we're in now is we released the straw dog rules a couple of weeks ago. We've received some written feedback. And I apologize to folks for the Google Doc format. I think we'll try to do something a little bit different than that. That was a little difficult to follow in terms of getting written comment. We do appreciate the written comments that we received by 10 a.m. on Monday. Commissioners have had a chance to review those comments. And now is the opportunity for 30 minutes or so for us I would encourage a conversational sort of tone to issue identify, to look at the straw dog from kind of a 10, 20, 30,000 foot viewpoint. I'd remind folks we're not drafting today, we're not deciding today, but we're providing feedback so that the next step can take place, and that is a final edits to the cumulative impact rules for posting in a formal rulemaking. So we're moving down this road from more informal approach to getting to a formal rulemaking for the months of February and March and April. With that, I would like to encourage Commissioner McGowan perhaps to go first with any feedback. She's been running front and central on the cumulative impact rulemaking for the last couple of months. And I think we all would appreciate her feedback from her seat as the Health and Environment Commissioner on our commission. Putting you on the spot there, Commissioner McGowan.
No, thank you,
Take me
Mr. Chair. Thank you. So I'm going to be looking away from my screen because my notes are to the side. So just so folks know what I'm doing. I felt the need to write things out because there have been a lot of really good comments, and I feel like I've been wrapped around the axle on a couple of issues. And so I'm just going to explain my kind of thought process and what I'm thinking. And I appreciate the opportunity to go first. I'm sure folks have a lot of other things that they'd like to add. So I'm looking forward just kickstarting us, I guess, jumpstarting us. So first, I just want to thank everybody for their thoughtful feedback and their participation. I know this has been a long journey. We've been doing this for a year and getting feedback and having meetings and listening sessions and informational dockets. And I know that a lot of people put a lot of thought into what they'd like to see next for cumulative impacts for the commission. I do want to revisit the themes that we heard from our informational listening sessions and our informational dockets. And they are, folks wanted to see us define cumulative impacts and disproportionately impacted communities. They wanted to see us improve processes that evaluate and address those impacts. They want us to consider thresholds or carrying capacities or allocation limits as part of our cumulative impacts assessment. They wanted to see us continue to improve collaboration with our sister agencies and improve verification processes that link the achievement of goals to our ECMC processes. In both written and verbal communications, we received feedback from stakeholders that we have missed the mark. I have to say that I felt incredibly deflated when we got that original feedback. However, as I have continued to review this draft and the comments related to the draft, I honestly think that criticism is a bit harsh. I think this draft is a good starting point, and someone had to get us started, so it's easy to throw stones at the first person who has to be the author. And I think I see elements that and these themes that folks said we wanted to address. I think those are in the bones here. I want to thank staff for taking the first step at including all of these themes in the draft. We can disagree how things are defined or proposed in the draft, but I do see definitions, attempts to improve our processes to evaluate cumulative impacts, thresholds related to greenhouse gases and NOx, decision points tied to CDPHE mission goals that improve collaboration and achievement of goals. And I think we have a good base to jump off here. I have a lot of metaphors in my comments, so just everybody enjoy. Okay. I also want to give my thoughts on what I am not including for consideration based on discussions that we've had as a commission during our listening sessions. Cumulative impacts is a large elephant to eat. And I feel based on comments from the past year, the largest focus from stakeholders has been on air quality and disproportionately impacted communities. So for this hearing, for the cumulative impacts, I've been focusing on what I'm calling a three-legged stool that focuses on greenhouse gases, NOx reductions, and disproportionately impacted communities. That does not mean that other issues aren't important. I believe that some issues are not ripe yet for consideration. For example, the Produced Water Consortium is likely to have recommendations around water use in oil and gas production and items that we should consider for cumulative impacts. I feel it is appropriate to wait for those recommendations and fold them into our rules after that work is done. Likewise, I think it is premature for this commission to tackle hazardous air pollutants. While some HAPs are priority pollutants and linked to health concerns, there are currently no approved health limits for these pollutants related to oil and gas activities. It's my understanding that CDPHE is undertaking a rulemaking to identify key priority pollutants that affect health outcomes and that may include HAPs. And they will adopt limits or goals for those pollutants. I think it's important, again, for the commission to revisit this issue after the folks at CDPHE have done their work. I've also had conversations and seen comments around wildlife protection, but feel that I lack clarity about what needs to change in our current rulemaking and the considerations we currently have related to current impacts, cumulative impacts, and wildlife. I think further conversation is warranted here. And finally, I've seen some requests for the commission to address reclamation and remediation as part of this rulemaking. While I personally think it is important for the commission to update those rules, I think that issue is so large and all-encompassing that it needs to be a standalone rulemaking in front of this commission. So, with the themes from our stakeholders in mind, along with the three-legged stool, I'd like to share some thoughts I have about the draft rules, and starting with definitions. So, starting with cumulative impacts, I do think it is appropriate for the commission to look at current and foreseeable impacts of oil and gas development to a community or geographic area. I also think it is appropriate for the cumulative impacts assessment to include impacts other than oil and gas as part of the assessment, and the list provided in the current definition could be a good starting place. This cumulative look can tell us what impacts already exist in an area and if adding oil and gas development will require certain decisions or strategies to ensure that impacts are avoided, minimized, or mitigated, and to what extent. I also agree that this commission only regulates oil and gas operations, and therefore the addressable part of cumulative impacts for the commission must be limited to oil and gas activities. I am interested in the concept of determining a baseline assessment, which lays out the current impacts compared to the impact of adding oil and gas development. Although I have to say I am struggling with what that process could and should look like. It needs to be done in a way that is transparent and useful in the commission's decision-making process and in a way that can help address impacts after we evaluate. Likewise, I am not wed to a specific area being defined for such an assessment, and lots of folks seem to have an opinion about the 1 mile. As a commissioner, I was originally supportive of the 1 mile because it's already required as, for information submittal as part of our Form 2B. I find feedback from Conservation Colorado, the Northwest Colorado Council of Governments, and Earth Justice of interest to me as ideas to consider for determining the depth, breadth, and scope of a cumulative impacts analysis. Rather than trying to set a distance within which to consider the cumulative effect of the OGDP for all purposes and locations, perhaps a better approach is to have the operator, as part of the OGDP process, submit a cumulative impact plan proposing what the impact areas should be, and let the state, staff, and local agency experts determine whether that makes sense. And that is a suggestion from NWCCOCOG. I think we should add that if we did that, another suggestion was to define what an impact area is, meaning the geographic location in which impacts of the oil and gas development on air quality, water quality, climate, noise, odor, and wildlife, and biological resources to disproportionately impacted communities are likely to occur. I think the shortfall of this proposal is that we will see a wide variety of submittal from operators. And while that is also the benefit of this, it perhaps will lack consistency and clarity when we are reviewing OGDPs and cause frustration for operators or for those who are also looking at those cumulative impact assessments. I think Conservation Colorado has a good idea, which is to consider the baseline as basically being the point of compliance. So where you are proposing development, you will look at what's happening with air quality, what's happening with wildlife, what's happening with noise and light, and determine whether or not cumulatively you have met expectations or not expectations. I think my struggle there again is there's no kind of defined geographic area from which we are taking this cumulative look, which could frustrate some folks and lack some clarity. I also feel like to a certain extent, that is currently what the commission is doing. We are saying to the oil and gas operator, what are you doing at this point? And what are the impacts that we see from air, wildlife, noise, soil impacts? And that doesn't seem to be satisfying to folks as far as an evaluation. So I'm looking forward to feedback on that piece as well. From for a definition of disproportionately impacted community, I think that the definition is appropriate. It is the state adopted definition. I think where we're maybe lacking and need some more work is these are areas that have already taken on their fair share of environmental impacts. So what are we going to do additionally to ensure that we are avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts to those communities? And I think that piece is not clear here in these draft rules, and we need to flesh that out more. I'm not sure that we need a definition for cumulatively impacted communities. In our rules, the only thing that we're really tying that to is what happens within a CAP. I think the CAP is actually a good example of a cumulative impacts assessment. That's the reason we put the CAP together. It's a landscape view of many or several locations combined together and a cumulative impacts view. I think if we set up protections for disproportionately impacted communities and require those same protections within a CAP, but we might not necessarily need a cumulatively impacted community definition. I think there's some very good comments from stakeholders around our definition for NOx and greenhouse gases. I think we probably need to clean that up a little bit so that it is clearly aligned with what's happening over at CDPHE. I'm interested in seeing us addressing and defining addressable impacts. I think there's some good language in the governor's letter. Consider separately defining the word addressable to mean capable of being avoided, minimized, or mitigated in a necessary and reasonable manner. I think that's related to the signing statement of 1294, where the governor said, the inclusion of the word addressable impacts is intended and will be implemented by my administration so as to ensure the commission, when making determinations where and how to avoid, mitigate, or minimize potential impacts, is acting within their statutorily defined role in permitting and overseeing direct impacts from oil and gas locations themselves. I think we probably need to be clear about where the Oil and Gas Commission, ECMC has authority. I'm super excited about the addition of a community liaison. I think that this commission could use assistance in working with disproportionately impacted communities. I would like to see, related to this position, language added from the Environmental Justice Act so that the goal of the community liaison is to improve outreach to and engagement with disproportionately impacted communities, to build trust and transparency, provide meaningful opportunities to influence public policy, and modify proposed state action in response to received public input to decrease environmental burdens or increase environmental benefits for each disproportionately impacted community. I'd like to see additional responsibilities added to this position. I think an ombudsman can help identify trends and work with the commission to address trends in disproportionately impacted communities. I think that that position can assist residents and provide education about our rules and processes and their rights within our rules and our processes. I think they can help residents in disproportionately impacted communities navigate our processes and ensure that their voice is a part of our deliberative process. I think C4C maybe has some good suggestions about how the liaison can help with training, consultation, and help it get information in a timely way. I thought the COGA APA suggestion about, is one sufficient, or should we have community liaisons per basin or per geographic area so that that person is embedded in community, is an interesting suggestion. I would like to see, and it doesn't need to be in the rules, but I would like to see consideration of having members of disproportionately impacted communities help us hire this position. I think it would be nice to have that voice at the table. I would like to talk a little bit about the NOx and greenhouse gases. And from my perspective, and I'm not sure that it's clear in the rules that this is how we want it set up, or maybe that was not our staff's intent. So I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the order in which I think the link to greenhouse gas and NOx intensity goals and operators and their application for OGDPs and to drill could or should be connected. One, I feel like an operator must be in compliance with the CDPHE greenhouse gas goals or NOx intensity goals to apply for a OGDP. If they are not on target, we should not support the addition of more emissions. Compliance is determined via required reporting over at CDPHE. For NOx, and as a reminder, I want to just let folks know we're putting a lot of pressure on ourselves and focus on the NOx intensity goals and targets, which only run through 2026, and we still have yet to figure out what the 2030 process and targets will be. And so this is an important piece, but know that we're also going to have to come back after the working group over at CDPHE comes up with strategies for 2030. So again, this is a work in progress. The operator must also meet with the director in consultation with CDPHE after the CDPHE February NOx report, which is when CDPHE, is my understanding, takes a step at QA/QCing the data that's been submitted by operators. And before ozone season, if an operator thinks they're going to be drilling during ozone season, they will have to meet with the director, and I would hope that this would be in consultation with CDPHE, to show that the new activity, the new emissions that they're estimating that will be added during drilling during ozone season, when added to looking backwards, they've submitted their data already for the past year, and they should be able to show that they're in compliance for the intensity target. Then they need to show us as a commission, if they add this new thing during ozone season, that those two things combined will still show compliance for the operator. And if that answer is yes, then I think there is a green light based on consultation with CDPHE and maybe some best management practices they may see that are required, could move forward. And this way, the director has a cumulative lens for all the operators that think they're going to be drilling during ozone season in consultation with CDPHE, and knows whether or not we need to make any sort of a different decision about who's drilling during ozone season, whether or not something needs to be delayed, and whether or not different BMPs might be required. Each year, CDPHE will have reporting to show if the industry as a whole is on target for both greenhouse gases and NOx goals. If industry as a whole is not on target for these goals, CDPHE will consult with the EMC about what strategies might have to be implemented related to new drilling and production activities to get industry as a whole back on target. This might be denying OGDPs until targets are met, delaying OGDPs until targets are met, requiring certain BMPs so targets can be met. delaying drilling timing so targets can be met, or other strategies. This is a regulatory feedback loop that uses the expertise of CDPHE's air quality monitoring and data and the ECMC's OGDP and drilling approval process to keep the state on track for its emissions targets. It is a collaborative process that best utilizes the tools, skills, and expertise of each agency. I do think also that the annual cumulative impacts report is a good tool for us to track how our progress is working. So we should be tracking in our cumulative impacts report whether or not industry is on target for these goals and whether or not we perhaps need to do something differently into the future. I think we're going to have to address grandfathering, what things get applied retroactively and what don't. I would like to see, sorry, I'm moving on now. I would like to see us working with CDPHE on the review of the Form 2Bs. We still haven't connected information that we're collecting in Form 2Bs, which are the estimates, and then creating a comparison to the actual data that's getting submitted over at CDPHE. And so I think that it's hard for us to track kind of what is the accuracy and the ground truthing in the Form 2Bs. I have heard CDPHE talking about how we might be able to review a Form 2B so that if something looks outside of the bell curve, for example, the commission could say, this looks outside of where we normally see operators, and why is that for you? And did you fat finger something and push the wrong number? Or are you using some sort of other technology or process that's more emitting than what we're seeing in general and is outside of that bell curve? So I would like to see us figure out how we can connect the Form 2Bs to actual data over at CDPHE and see and track over time if we are reducing emissions. I'm going to go back to the annual cumulative impacts report and whether or not we are appropriately using it to evaluate and then address impacts. I think we've taken a first step at that. So for example, based on our cumulative, our annual impacts data, we already know that emissions from operators are coming from two main sources. It's drilling and completions, and then it's related to some equipment and truck traffic during production. So we know that those are areas that we need to hone in on. What other kinds of impacts should we be looking at in the cumulative impacts report to help us adjust how we are regulating to get to certain goals? I think there's some cleanup stuff from parties that they've submitted, that there was a lot of them, and so I didn't go through each one, but some comments about why 40 days here, but 45 days here, but 60 days here for comment, for example. Do we need 2 meetings, or can we get something done with one? I think we probably need to take a look at those things. And then I just wanted to finally say, I'm hoping that as we move forward, I have some suggestions about maybe how we could improve how we're doing this and get better participation, or help people understand what it is that we're doing. I'm hoping that the red line that gets submitted to the Secretary of State will have some sort of executive summary attached to it, so folks who are not familiar with our rulemaking can have a high level understanding of what the proposed red line does and why. If you just were looking at our draft red line and you don't understand our rules, I think it was difficult to navigate and figure out what the intent was of what we're trying to achieve. And I think it would help people to have some sort of a executive summary. I'm hoping that we will have the red line and executive summary available in Spanish. I'm hoping that we could share the red line available in a Word doc, so it's easier for folks to put their comments in. And I've been cutting and pasting stuff from the PDF, and it's laborious, and I'm going to guess other people are facing the same thing. So I'm hoping we can submit it also in a kind of a Word doc so people can do their edits in it. And then I'm hoping that for one of our feedback hearings, we will have interpretation services available. And I think that's it for me. I'm looking forward to working more with everybody. And if folks have more suggestions on how we can make sure that moving forward, everyone feels included, then we're open to everything there and looking forward to hearing from other commissioners.
Thank you very much, Commissioner McGowan. That was extensive, well thought out, and provides a really good conversation starter for us on this point. I think it would be helpful next to hear from Commissioner Cross. Commissioner Cross, for folks in the room, is the commissioner that is appointed as the industry seat. And so perhaps hearing that approach next would be appropriate. So again, I don't normally do this, but I'm putting Commissioner Cross on the hot seat.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner McGowan, for leading off. I know, as you said, it's easy to throw stones at the first drafter, and I think it puts a lot of pressure on the first person to speak on this as well. So I do appreciate your comments, and admittedly, a lot of your comments were similar to some of the comments I had. So I'll be brief in some of those as well. I do want to start off by saying thank you to staff for the hard work in putting this together. As Commissioner McGowan said, it's not easy. It was trying to put things together based on commissioner comments, based on listening sessions, based on written comments from before. So I do appreciate the hard work done by staff to put these together. I also just want to say thank you to the public at large. There was a lot of comments that were filed, informal filings, as well as many people that have already signed up to be parties to the rulemaking. And I read some of the basic comments provided on some of those as well. And honestly, it's a little nerdy of me, but I was very excited to see this many people interested in what's happening, and it makes me excited to go through this process. I do want to make kind of a high-level comment in that I'm not going to be responding to all the comments. I have made notes on all the different comments that have been submitted, some thoughts for and some against in respect to different things, but I'm not going to touch on all those today. I think we're going to have plenty of time to discuss these issues, especially in more detail. Instead, I want to provide more of a high-level summary of kind of some of my suggestions and some of the things that I think are worth touching upon. So I'll begin with the definitions, and even though I said I'm not going to respond to some of them, I do think it's appropriate to start with addressing some of the comments about the definition itself. I want to start by saying I think this is a very good start to the definition of cumulative impacts. It is consistent with our jurisdictional authority. I think it covers reasonably foreseeable future impacts as requested by many commenters, and it looks at non-oil and gas impacts. That said, I think we can look at some small changes, but specifically responding to some of the comments that were submitted, I do think it's important to note some of the jurisdictional issues that we face. And ultimately, I think this definition is a jurisdictional issue that will form the basis of all of our rules. In our governing statute, we are required to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. And thus, I think it's important that we not take on or define things as cumulative impacts that we cannot evaluate and address. Commissioner McGowan specifically touched on the signing letter that talks about what is an addressable impact. I know several commenters wrote what we should define addressable impacts, and I do think that that's reasonable, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I think it's important that we don't try and make a cumulative impact something that we cannot ultimately regulate, because then we're setting ourselves up for failure with what's mandated by our governing statute. So if you look at first the fact that our statute says we must evaluate and address, that forms our basis. When you specifically look at HB 23-1294, it says in promulgating the definition of cumulative impacts by rule pursuant to subsection 11D1 of this section, the commission, quote, shall review, consider, and include addressable impacts to climate, public health, the environment, air quality, water quality, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources, and to disproportionately impact to communities. So I think right away, we're again looking at addressable impacts. Similarly, as Commissioner McGowan noted, in the signing statement that Governor Polis submitted with this when he signed it, he said, the inclusion of the word addressable impacts is, quote, intended and will be implemented by my administration so as to ensure the commission, when making determinations where and how to avoid, mitigate, or minimize potential impacts, is acting within their statutorily defined role in permitting and overseeing direct impacts from oil and gas locations themselves. Ultimately, I think the key thing here is that we don't try and overstep and try and say, we have to look at everything. We have to address everything that's happening in an area. Ultimately, what we can regulate, what we can address is tied to oil and gas impacts. So I do understand some of the frustration by some of the commenters about the fact that it stops about oil and gas resources. And I know a lot of people resubmitted suggested changes going back to the NEPA definition, but ultimately, this isn't NEPA. We have to stick with what we have jurisdictional authority to regulate. Similarly, I think it's appropriate to again recognize that this is not NEPA. NEPA is a federal statute that is procedural in nature. It has no substantive impact. We are a commission that specifically looks at substantive impacts and how to regulate those impacts. We are not looking at a procedure where we have to evaluate all potential impacts. I think it's also important to note that some commenters said, well, the BLM already looks at all activities occurring within a resource management area under the resource management plans. Again, I think it's important to distinguish the fact that BLM has jurisdictional authority over those activities within these federally managed resource management areas. We do not have regulatory authority over everything within a mile, within 2,000 feet, within regional bases, as some of the different commenters suggested. And so again, in the actual definition of cumulative impacts, I think it's critical to focus on what we can address. It's consistent with statute. It's consistent with the statute that what the legislature asked us to define here. And I think it's consistent with our executive direction in the signing statement provided by Governor Polis. One final note is I also don't want to mandate some sort of evaluation that's going to create a procedural requirement or a procedural obligation that we may not be able to fulfill. A lot of NEPA litigation that occurs is because people argue this was not taken a hard enough look at. We didn't properly address all cumulative impacts. We didn't address all indirect impacts, all direct impacts. They could have looked at this more. They could have looked at this, but they could have also looked at the social cost of carbon. And so I think it's important to note that we don't want to create this evaluation obligation for things that we don't ultimately address that can open up the commission to litigation because we didn't look at something enough, or we didn't look at every single thing that could have been looked at. And so I think, again, if we're looking at the difference between NEPA as a procedural statute and the substantive mandates we have to regulate oil and gas here, I think it's important that we understand those boundaries as we define cumulative impacts. So as I said initially, I do think that there are some changes and some clarifications that can be made. Both many industry and non-industry groups alike has expressed some concern about the use of the phrase industrial manufacturing operations in the definition. I think while the nature of the comments differed, some wanting those specific operations to be better defined, others wanting a more expansive list of the potentially insignificant land uses, I think this is something that we could clarify. I know there was a lot of talk about what is a potentially significant land use. I know Commissioner Messner in the past has expressed some concerns about some of the land use issues, and I think this is something we should look at in a little bit more detail to understand. As we do have the option, as the signing letter says, we do have the option to look at additional non-addressable impacts. What should we be looking at? What is appropriate to be looking at? So potentially defining potentially significant land uses, expanding on what is meant by industrial and manufacturing operations. I don't think it's limiting. It does say including industrial manufacturing operations, and I think that's appropriate. But just to get an understanding of what we're looking at, it would be appropriate. And again, as Commissioner McGowan indicated, I think that defining addressable impacts is reasonable. It's again consistent with our executive direction and would prevent future interpretation disputes. Lastly, if we are looking for consistency with our sister agency, I think we can either use the definition of cumulatively impacted communities that's used by AQCC, or we can explain the differences between the two. I know Commissioner McGowan just indicated that she thought that maybe we don't even need the definition, and perhaps that could be as well. But I did find it interesting that the definitions we're using what AQCC has done, but we're also not using their definition. And so I think that that's something that we could consider as well. Next, I want to talk about the liaison. I agree with Commissioner McGowan. I think this is a great inclusion in our rules that not only addresses the legislative mandate to support community engagement, outreach, and participation, but it's consistent with many of the comments expressed from stakeholders throughout the public hearings and the listening sessions over the last year. And I think that there were some comments that expressed a desire to expand the role of the liaison. I think that that's something we could look at, and I know Commissioner McGowan talked about it as well. I do want to say, I don't think Rule 224 as proposed limits the role as expressed by some of those comments, but I think we could look to see if some illustrative examples could be added to the rule. Additionally, I do think it's appropriate to maybe place some limitations on the rule as well. I know some comments talked about the fact that a community liaison should not be providing legal advice, and I think that's appropriate. And I think it's easy to point to in rule if somebody asks for legal advice to say that that's not my role here. They can help provide resources to help obtain legal advice, but that's not the role of the liaison. So I think that that's something that can be done. And similar to Commissioner McGowan, I think that I'd be in favor of looking at multiple liaisons if that's something that's feasible within the budget as well. It could be helpful, especially if we're looking at disproportionately impacted communities. Next, I'd like to talk about the pre-application consultation. During the questioning last week, when first getting a look at these rules, I did ask about the timing of the meetings as coordinating a time between RBU owners or tenants who have their own jobs and other consulting parties for whom this consultation is part of their job can be very difficult. So I think it's appropriate to have some clarification on allowing separate meetings or, you know, what a meeting might look like between the RBU owners or the RBU tenants as opposed to the proximate local governments and CDPHE, et cetera. I think it would also be appropriate there to try and make sure everyone's on the same page. If one meeting happens before the other, you could have something that shares this is what was expressed at the other meeting, as opposed to that only being shared with staff. I do also think it's important to have some kind of language in there that would allow for waivers of the meeting. I know we did talk about last week and staff expressed, you know, there's obviously going to be situations where maybe there's one RBU owner and they provide informed consent. So it doesn't really seem necessary to have a meeting if the one RBU owner has already provided informed consent and one would expect has gone through some of the information and understands the process of what's happening going on. But I think some kind of clarification would be appropriate with that as well. Looking at Rule 304C19, our cumulative impacts plan. One of the things, and again, Commissioner McGowan touched on this as well. Under the 2B as written, we look at other sources, other impacts within a mile. It's something that we already have in our rules. It's something we've already been doing. So I did find it interesting that we're looking at 2,000 feet here for other sources instead of the 1 mile that everybody is already looking at in the 2B. And so I think it would actually be appropriate to have the mile here rather than the 2,000 feet. I would also note there was a lot of comments about what should be included and in terms of looking at the other sources from industrial sources, et cetera, in this cumulative impact plan, what information must be quantified, or should it be qualitative, or what has to be described and the level of detail. And ultimately, I think that it's probably important to leave this a little bit more open-ended. I think some clarification could be appropriate, especially to say that information that is readily available, because there are going to be situations where maybe they're looking at another plant or something, and that plant is not sharing, that has a proposed permit or a pending permit, but it's not, they haven't released public information about some of the quantitative information. from emissions such as methane, et cetera. And so if that's not readily available, it doesn't really make sense to require an operator to provide that information. But I do think that a qualitative description of this information could be appropriate. And it's, again, probably best left to the operator to determine what the appropriate level is there. And then staff could say, we need more information than this. Next, Rule 904. And I just want to confirm with this whether the intensity verification is with respect to the operator on a company-wide basis, which is consistent with the intensity programs, or specific to the proposed OGDP. Commissioner McGowan again touched on this in her comments as well. If it is indeed the latter, looking at the proposed OGDP, I think it would be helpful to have some clarification as well, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what specific information is going to be applied. I know there was comments about, well, information is not necessarily going to be known. And while it may not be known, maybe having some kind of estimation methodology would be appropriate here to make sure we're on the same page. We're understanding what information is being supplied. I know some of the comments that we've had over the past year have talked about the fact that when we look at estimates in the 2B versus what's actually reported to CDPHE, we're looking at apples and oranges, and we want to make sure that we're on the same page with that. And I think it's appropriate to make sure we're looking at the same page here as well, to make sure that if we are indeed looking at this, the NOx intensity verification, if we are indeed looking at the GHG intensity verification, we're working on the same kind of materials to make sure that we are consistent, we are meeting our obligations to reduce NOx and GHG as required. And so I think that is appropriate if we are indeed looking at this on a proposed OGDP level and not a company-wide basis level, as is done by the intensity verification programs. Also, I think within 904 it would be appropriate to provide some guidelines with respect to the circumstances under which the director might not approve a Form 4. Right now, it just says if they are meeting their intensity verification, then the director may approve. And so I think if there's situations in which staff had an idea that the director may not approve it, just providing some kind of explanation of what those guidelines, what those boundaries would be, so it doesn't seem like an arbitrary process. And then finally, I do want to again touch on a couple of other comments that were raised by commenters. And again, I'll be brief on this because Commissioner McGowan did touch on these as well. While I do think that there were some issues not addressed in the draft rules, such as wildlife and water, I think that they are appropriately left out in this draft. As we've previously commented, we have undertaken efforts with respect to the high priority habitat map updates, the Produced Water Consortium, to look at the impacts to these resources. And as we get a better understanding of the findings from the Produced Water Consortium, as we get a better understanding of any potential future habitat map updates, we can update our rules at that time consistent with that. Similarly, I think it's not appropriate for us to address HAPs or VOCs, as CDPHE has the experts to determine the appropriate baselines here. Moreover, we have already been told they're undertaking these efforts. It doesn't make sense for ECMC to identify baselines or regulations with respect to issues for which we neither have the jurisdiction nor the expertise, and it doesn't make sense to duplicate efforts of other agencies. And again, once CDPHE has identified the appropriate thresholds and or regulations, we can address our rules accordingly. I know I've said it at several of our listening sessions and at other times, I do not see this rulemaking as the end. I think that cumulative impacts are something that, as we understand different impacts, whether it's air, whether it's water, whether it's wildlife, moving forward, as we get a better understanding of what's appropriate, we will continue to update our rules. This is not a one-shot attempt to address all cumulative impacts. I think it's well done and well-versed to address what we can address at this point in time. Our sister agency has taken the time to come up with NOx verification rules. Our sister agency has taken the time to come up with GHG intensity verification rules. And I think relying on those experts in our sister agency is appropriate. And when our sister agency or agencies come up with appropriate baselines and thresholds on other issues, I do think it's appropriate to talk about those then as well. But I'll just conclude again by saying thank you to staff for the hard work. Thank you to the public for all the comments provided. I know, speaking for myself and presumably the other commissioners, it's kept us busy over the last few days reading through all these comments. And so I do appreciate all the work being done to date by everyone involved, and I do look forward to continue to work on this process.
Thank you, Commissioner Cross. Again, well articulated comments for us. Starting to see some alignment on some of the issues and some non-alignment on some of the issues, and that's what this is all about. I just remind all of our stakeholders, there's 100 or so listening in, that we're not making decisions today, we're not drafting today, we're just issue identifying and trying to provide some next steps direction for staff before they publish the cumulative impacts rule that will be part of the formal hearing. Commissioner Messner, would you like to weigh in with thoughts, having heard from your fellow commissioners?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to, and really appreciate the thoughtfulness of my fellow commissioners in developing their comments. And I, like Commissioner McGowan, you know, as I was approaching this, you know, really at times got wrapped around the axle on a few things, and like trying to work through a lot of the issues that were identified. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach here, and I'll apologize, as I often do, to my fellow commissioners, because this is going to be lengthy. But I think it's important for me to identify the rationale for how I'm reviewing the draft rules, and really how I'm approaching cumulative impacts rulemaking in general, and kind of the lens that I'm looking through as I start to process the different stakeholder comments and draft rules that'll be developed over the course of the rulemaking. And so I'm going to start and just kind of work through this a little bit. So one of the things I wanted to identify was kind of the areas that I'm focusing my evaluation, and where I'm generating some of the lens in which I'm looking at this rulemaking through. And certainly one of them is House Bill 23-1294. And I'm not going to read through all of HB 1294, because I think most of the stakeholders or the public, and certainly the commissioners and staff that are involved with this, you know, are familiar with this legislation. But the highlighted pieces that I think are important to identify is HB 23-1294 requires us to promulgate rules that evaluate and address the cumulative impacts in oil and gas operations, and it needs to include a definition of cumulative impacts. It also directs us to provide resources to support community engagement in the process from affected communities, including translation, outreach, and other strategies to support public participation. It also indicates the commission shall review, consider, and include addressable impacts to climate, public health, the environment, air quality, water quality, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources, and to disproportionately impacted communities as defined by statute. And finally, it does indicate that impacts to climate means quantification of emissions of greenhouse gases as defined in section 27.7.146 that occur from sources that are controlled or owned by the operator, and reasonably foreseeable truck traffic at an oil and gas location. The other source in which I'm developing my lens for this rulemaking is the governor's signing letter for HB 23-1294, which a section of it indicates the inclusion of the word addressable impacts is intended and will be implemented by my administration so as to ensure the commission, when making determinations where and how to avoid, mitigate, and minimize potential impact, is acting within their statutorily defined role in permitting and overseeing direct impacts from oil and gas locations themselves. It also goes on to say that while some impacts may not be addressable, they can still be analyzed to develop a fuller picture, and I think that's important. The other section in which I'm developing my lens is certainly Senate Bill 19-181, which directs a lot of the work that we do, which indicates in consultation with the Department of Public Health and the Environment. And I emphasize that it does indicate that we need to work in consultation with our sister agency to evaluate and address the potential cumulative impacts of oil and gas development. And also the governor's NOx reduction order letter, which states that despite passing meaningful and effective legislation to reduce emissions from oil and gas operations, the sector still has a significant impact on our state's air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. Put simply, just as we need to do more in transportation and other sectors, we need to do more to reduce emissions from oil and gas operations in Colorado. So today I am directing a series of major administrative actions to significantly and expeditiously cut air emissions from this sector and support our overall air quality and greenhouse gas reduction objectives. Goes on to say that he's directing the COGCC and CDPHE to work together to develop a rule or rules by the end of 2024 that requires upstream oil and gas operators in the ozone non-attainment area to achieve at least a 30% reduction of NOx during the ozone season in 2025, and at least 50% in 2030 from a 2017 baseline as used in the current SIP. To achieve the NOx targets, the AQCC should engage in a rulemaking that will most effectively reduce sector-wide NOx through available control strategies and consider whether the rule is suitable for adoption in the SIP. These emissions reductions should be verifiable and reportable to the public, to the COGCC, CDPHE, and AQCC should revisit and consider updating these targets at least every 3 years. Also directed the COGCC through rulemaking to solidify environmental best management practices addressing ozone and should revisit and consider updating these practices regularly. In addition to those that are helping develop my lens is also the statement of basis and purpose that was developed during the mission change rulemaking. And to me, this is really important because the framework that's being developed here in the draft rules really utilize the existing framework that we developed during the mission change rulemaking. So I do want to take a little time to help flesh out some sections in the statement of basis and purpose in our rules that I will be using to develop the lens in which I'll approach this cumulative impacts rulemaking. So first of all, and kind of overarching in the statement of basis and purpose, it indicates that that the commission did not intend for the mission change rulemaking to be the final or only rulemaking to implement Senate Bills 19-181's mandate to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. And I think that's important because that is another mechanism in which to look at the current rulemaking so that it is not so narrow as to just focus on 1294 as the directive. So current practices to evaluate and address cumulative impacts, I think is important. As I read through a lot of the comments that were provided, I think as was indicated by Commissioner Cross and Commissioner McGowan, there's some confusion about, I think, what we currently do. And not everyone is confused for sure, but there is some confusion about what we currently do and we developed during mission change to evaluate and address cumulative impacts and how these new draft rules work within the existing rules. And so I want to talk just a little bit about that. So in page 2 of the statement of basis and purpose, which is around cumulative impacts. It indicates that Senate Bill 19-181 also directed the commission to adopt rules in consultation with the Department of Public Health and the Environment to evaluate and address the potential cumulative impacts of oil and gas development. Because evaluating and addressing potential cumulative impacts is inextricably tied to many of the commission's other rules that were subject to revision in the mission change rulemaking, the commission chose to revise its rules to evaluate and address cumulative impacts as part of its mission change rulemaking. To me, this indicates that a number of rules throughout our existing rules were developed specifically to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. Statement of basis and purpose, page 17, rules 303A5, 304C19, 314, 423D, 423F, 426E, 427E, and 603D implement Senate Bills 19-181's requirement for the commission to adopt regulations to evaluate and address the potential cumulative impacts of oil and gas development. So again, I highlight these two sections of the statement of basis and purpose, as it is my opinion that no one rule or no one action is going to enable any agency to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. It is in fact the collective efforts of all of the rules properly implemented that will be the mechanism for evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. And this concept will influence my opinions as I review draft rules and concepts. So going on in the statement of basis and purpose on page 62, which is again about cumulative impacts, a crucial component of the 200 to 600 mission change rulemaking is the commission implementing Senate Bill 19-181's requirement to evaluate and address the potential cumulative impacts of oil and gas development. At the more granular level, in Rule 303A5, the Commission created a new Form 2B to collect data about cumulative impacts from each newly proposed oil and gas development plan. This information will populate a database that can be used to evaluate cumulative impacts. Additionally, operators must submit a cumulative impacts plan as an attachment to a Form 2A pursuant to Rule 304C19, in which operators must demonstrate that their plans to address cumulative impacts of each proposed oil and gas location by avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating these impacts. The Commission intends for staff to critically evaluate the information submitted on both the Form 2B pursuant to Rule 303A5 and in Cumulative Impacts Plan pursuant to 304C19 to verify that operators are making robust and thorough efforts to meaningfully address cumulative impacts to relevant resources. This evaluation will inform the director's recommendation pursuant to Rule 306. The Commission will evaluate the operator's cumulative impacts plan and the director's recommendation about whether the plan is sufficient in the course of reviewing and determining whether to approve or deny each oil and gas development plan pursuant to Rule 307. Again, this is in the current rules, current statement of basis and purpose. It goes on to say, because in Rule 901A, the Commission created a process for the annual reporting by its staff about information gathered in the database each year and other information relevant to evaluating cumulative impacts of oil and gas development compiled by other agencies and research institutions. Rule 904C also allows the Commission to convene an informational docket on its own motion to solicit information relevant to evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. And based on the information in this annual report or gathered through an informational docket, the Commission may determine that it is necessary and reasonable to undertake further regulatory efforts to evaluate or address cumulative impacts to specific resources at a later date. Like I said, it's going to be a little bit lengthy, but I think it's really important for me to identify what currently is happening so that we minimize some of the confusion about what will be modified in future drafts as well as this draft. So I want to talk a little more about 303A5 and the rule itself and statement of basis and purpose. The statement of basis and purpose indicates that Rule 303A5 is the cornerstone of the Commission's broader approach to evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. As Rule 303A5A explains, the rule is intended to be a first step towards developing the cumulative impacts data evaluation repository, which is the CIDR, which is a baseline data set that we can use to facilitate the Commission's ongoing efforts to evaluate cumulative impacts of oil and gas operations in Colorado. And consistent with Rule 904, which requires the director to provide an annual report on data gathered in CIDR, the Commission intends to use data from CIDR in cooperation with CDPHE and other partners to undertake basin-wide, statewide, and other studies to evaluate cumulative impacts to relevant resources at appropriate scales. Although it is beyond the purview of the mission change rulemaking for the commission to identify every possible cumulative impacts evaluation that site or data may be used for, the commission intends for the types of evaluations that might be conducted to include coordinating with CDPHE to evaluate statewide cumulative greenhouse gas emissions from oil and gas operations, coordinating with CDPHE to evaluate ozone precursor emissions from oil and gas operations, and coordinating with CPW to evaluate cumulative impacts to wildlife resources. These are some of the things that have been undertaken at our sister agency at CPW, and certainly work that continues to be done, or CDPHE, and continues to be done at CPW. And so I want to highlight that. And so I want to go on to talk a little further about 303A5, as this is, and 904, as these are elements that in the framework are ultimately going to be utilized, potentially utilized in the cumulative impacts rulemaking. So other commission rules adopted in the mission change rulemaking are intended to address cumulative impacts. This is a statement of basis and purpose again. These rules include Rule 314 governing CAPs, which provide a tool for landscape level planning that could be used to address cumulative impacts to various resources by facilitating consolidation of infrastructure, electrification, and intentionally phased timing of development. Rule 304C19 requires operators to submit a cumulative impacts plan. And similarly, Rule 603D and E governing well consolidation and development from existing location set statewide standards for operations to consolidate new development onto multi-well pads and existing well pads, which are key tools the commission identified to address cumulative impacts caused by surface disturbance, such as habitat fragmentation. Additionally, Rules 423, 424, 426, 427 provide substantive standards to address cumulative noise, light, odor, and dust impacts, respectively. The commission, and so I'm stating these things in the statement of basis and purpose in the rules to really identify that all the rules that were developed during the mission change rulemaking ultimately are designed to help address cumulative impacts and are designed to work together within the Form 2A and other mechanisms to look at all these things in OGDP applications and other permitting processes. Rule 303B5, is if you evaluate the rule itself as currently provided, it really is a robust mechanism for evaluating potential impacts to resources or potential impacts associated with an application that need to be identified and analyzed. And that includes impacts associated with air resources. The 303B5 requires a quantitative evaluation of incremental increase to the pollutants, which are listed below. Estimated for the entire proposed oil and gas development plan. The mission estimates will include both stationary and mobile sources of the emissions during all pre-production activities, and both stationary and mobile sources of emissions for the first year of production based on all proposed wells and equipment. The emissions need to include oxides of nitrogen, carbon monoxide, VOCs, methane, ethane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. From a public health standpoint, there's quantitative evaluation of incremental increases in total HAPs. There's a quantitative evaluation increase in the total hazardous air pollutants as well. And then a qualitative evaluation of any potential acute or chronic, short or long-term incremental impacts to public health as a result of such emissions. It also asks information about water resources and surrounding oil and gas impacts, which includes the total number of active, permitted, and proposed oil and gas locations within a 1 mile radius, the cumulative total acreage that is currently disturbed or is planned to be disturbed, to construct the active oil and gas locations associated with the OGDP within a 1 mile radius, and the sources to calculate the total acreage. It also includes the other industrial impacts on the Form 2B, which will identify existing industrial facilities within a 1 mile radius of each of the proposed oil and gas locations, including general descriptions and use of operation of the industrial facilities. Moving on to the statement of basis and purpose, page 64, it says, although the purpose of the Form 2B is to evaluate cumulative impacts, the Form 2B is also intended to encourage operators to consider options for increasing the incremental contribution of their proposed oil and gas for operations to the cumulative impacts to various resources. They may include on the Form 2B measures they plan to take to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any adverse impacts. And the operators intend for the Form 2B to provide information about any measure the operator is taking to address adverse impacts that are identified on the Form 2B but are not discussed elsewhere in the oil and gas development plan. And I think finally in Rule 303A5B, the commission intends the operator is required to submit information about incremental impacts to public welfare. Commission intends for the data submitted about impacts to these resources that are critical to public welfare on the Form 2B to be a qualitative evaluation that provides information not elsewhere apparent in the operator's oil and gas development plan application. So interesting, on page 70 of the statement of basis and purpose in the mission change rulemaking, the commission recognized that understanding cumulative impacts requires information about past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future impacts. To better understand what impacts already exist in an area where oil and gas development is proposed, the Rule 303A5C requires operators to provide information about what surrounding oil and gas impacts are on the Form 2B. And over time, this will create a baseline of data about impacts of existing oil and gas infrastructure in which the commission may compare incremental impacts of a proposed oil and gas development plan. The commission recognizes the importance of a baseline analysis of existing impacts to evaluate cumulative impacts. And then I want to go on and just talk a little bit about the form or the Rule 304C19, because this is another important piece in the proposed framework that was developed by the Straw Dog Rule draft. And so Rule 304C19, which is the cumulative impacts plan, is a plan documenting how the operator will address cumulative impacts to the resources identified pursuant to Rule 303A5. That includes a description of all resources to which cumulative impacts are expected to be increased, a description of the specific measures taken to avoid or minimize to the extent to which cumulative adverse impacts are increased, a description of all measures taken to mitigate or offset cumulative adverse impacts to any of the resources, and any additional information determined to be reasonable and necessary to evaluate for the evaluation of cumulative impacts by the operator, the director, CDPHE, CPW, or the relevant local government. So fleshing that out a little bit, the statement of basis and purpose on page 91, the commission determined that these plans will allow its staff and commission itself to work with an operator to identify appropriate means to address any cumulative impacts identified in the Form 2B, which otherwise serves primarily as a data gathering function. Addressing the cumulative impacts of individual locations proposed as part of an oil and gas development plan is particularly necessary because oil and gas development plans may include multiple locations. As the number of locations associated with proposed oil and gas development increases, the method for identifying, avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating cumulative impacts associated with the proposed development also increases. Rule 304C19 requires operators to describe anticipated cumulative impacts to each resource. This is intended to be an estimate of both incremental, adverse, and beneficial impacts to each resource, and a net estimate rather than a gross estimate. 304C19B requires operators to describe specific measures taken to avoid or minimize any incremental increase in adverse cumulative impacts. The Commission intentionally used the term avoid and minimize in Rule 304C19B, consistent with the definitions of those terms adopted in the mission change rulemaking. The Rule 304C19C requires operators identify any measures taken to mitigate or offset cumulative adverse impacts to any resources. Mitigation refers to taking action to reduce an adverse impact to the same resource at some other location to compensate for adverse impacts to that resource from a proposed oil and gas location. But the mitigation hierarchy is expected to be utilized in this particular rule as it talks about first avoiding, then minimizing, then mitigating. And finally, for this in Rule 304C19D, the Commission intends for the staff to engage with CDPHE and other partner agencies to develop guidance about specific categories and information that might be deemed reasonable and necessary to evaluate cumulative impacts pursuant to 304C19D, as the Commission has the ability to ask for any additional information as part of Rule 304C19D. So with the finally on page 62, the statement of basis and purpose, I'm going to reiterate that that the goal of 304C19 and the cumulative impacts plan is that operators must demonstrate their plans to address cumulative impacts of each proposed oil and gas location by avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating those impacts. The Commission intends for its staff to critically evaluate the information submitted on both the Form 2B pursuant to Rule 303A5 and in the cumulative impacts plan pursuant to Rule 304C19 to verify that operators are making robust and thorough efforts to meaningfully address cumulative impacts to relevant resources. This evaluation will inform the director's recommendation pursuant to Rule 306, and then the Commission will evaluate the operator's cumulative impacts plan and the director's recommendation about whether that plan is sufficient in the course of reviewing and determining whether to approve or deny each oil and gas development plan pursuant to Rule 307. And so I apologize for the length of that, but I think it's really important because when we're developing this framework that was proposed, it really is designed to utilize the existing rules. And if we're designed to utilize the existing framework of the rules, including the Form 2B, the cumulative impacts plan, and other mechanisms inside of the existing rules, I think it's good to re-emphasize what those current rules expectations are in order to determine how these new expansions of those sections can be applied. And so, and also to better explain the lens that I'm using in order to go through my thoughts on the draft. And so I'll go into the thoughts on the draft now. So when I first evaluated the straw dog version of the draft rules to determine what I was trying to do is to determine if, generally speaking, the framework that has been developed is one that is able to accomplish the directives that were given in the earlier part of my discussion, which include House Bill 23-1294 and the governor's signing letter, the governor's order on NOx reductions, SB 19-181, and the mission change SBP. My finding is generally yes, the framework proposed does enable these directives to be accomplished in this rulemaking. The framework utilizes the existing structure of the rules with modifications and additions to attempt to accomplish these directives. The draft rules identify the utilization of the Form 2B and the cumulative impacts plan as some of the appropriate tools for evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. The draft incorporates CDPHE's NOx and greenhouse gas operator-specific intensity targets into ECMC permitting processes. It attempts to define cumulative impacts and updates the definition of disproportionately impacted community. It develops a new role in the community liaison. It expands the participation in pre-application meetings. It expands and clarifies the utilization of consultations in the permitting processes. It expands and clarifies notice requirements. It expands the submittal requirements in the Form 2B and the analysis and addressing requirements as part of the cumulative impacts plan. It expands the requirements of the community outreach plan. It reduces the ability to utilize lesser impact areas in the permitting process. And finally, it expands and makes significant modifications to the comprehensive area plan application process. I think staff should be commended for their significant efforts in developing this initial STRADOG draft, which is important to understand that it is the very first crack at developing draft rules for this rulemaking prior to the formal rulemaking process even beginning. I also very much appreciate the significant effort that has been made over the course of the last year to solicit input and feedback from a wide array of stakeholders and community members led by Commissioners Ackerman and McGowan, as well as a number of different staff members. Putting pen to paper to develop the initial draft of any rules is no easy task, especially knowing that whatever you put to paper will begin the process of significant analysis and scrutiny from stakeholders and commissioners. So before I begin my analysis and scrutiny, I just want to make sure I show my appreciation for the work and courage it takes to develop a first stab at developing these rules, and rules that will undergo a number of iterations as we continue this rulemaking process. So for all of that, I want to thank you. And I also want to thank all of the stakeholders and community members who have taken the time to participate in the process, provide feedback and insights, and have provided numerous written comments and suggestions prior to the development of the draft rules and in the process we are currently undertaking. A significant thank you is also due to you, and I hope to continue to engage with everyone throughout this rulemaking process. So on to my suggestions. Start with the cumulative impacts definition. So for me, defining cumulative impacts is not only required by HB 23-1294, but is an important part of developing these rules. The definition needs to provide clarity, but importantly, it must be able to be utilized in all sections of the rules that relate to cumulative impacts. So there needs to be a broadness within the definition, but also enough specificity to clarify what is to be expected. There was guidance provided by the legislation on what needed to be included and what should not be included. With that, I like the definition of cumulative impacts provided by Northwest COG. That definition of cumulative impacts means the addressable combined impacts from oil and gas operations on public health and the environment, including the impacts on air quality, water quality, climate, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources, and to disproportionately impacted communities. In evaluating cumulative impacts, the Commission will consider the incremental impacts from proposed oil and gas operations when added to impacts from past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future development within the impact area of the proposed oil and gas location, including without limitation, industrial and manufacturing operations that have pending or approved permits or in current operations. It also defines impact area, which means the geographic areas in which impacts of the oil and gas development on air quality, water quality, the climate, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources, and to disproportionately impacted communities are likely to occur. I think including a specific 1 mile metric in the drafted definition is unnecessarily narrow, and the specific metrics can be placed in other sections of the rules that are specific to the resource identified. I think the utilization of impact area makes sense. I also think that the phrase past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future is appropriate in the definition, as these are things that are already contemplated in the existing rules as highlighted in my previous recital in the statement of basis and purpose from the mission change rulemaking on page 70, which indicates the commission recognizes that understanding cumulative impacts requires information about past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future impacts. So I go on to indicate that I generally agree with many of the comments provided by Conservation Colorado and WCA, as well as other stakeholders with similar sentiments. I like the comments that were provided by Conservation Colorado in their red line to the community liaison in draft rule 224A. I like the additional requirements in the Form 2B to include baseline air quality monitoring for particulate matter, VOCs, benzene, and NOx. I think this is to build upon the knowledge and information collected in CIDR to both inform current applications as well as future rulemakings and studies. As indicated in the current statement of basis and purpose, page 70, the commission recognizes the importance of baseline analysis of existing impacts to evaluating cumulative impacts. The baseline database may inform not only the commission's decisions about individual oil and gas development plans or proposals, but also wider evaluations of cumulative impacts of oil and gas development in a given region. So I think that utilizing even the mechanism provided by Reg 7, baseline air quality monitoring for those constituents makes sense. And I want to emphasize that this would be in addition to the projections of these emissions already required as part of the Form 2B submittal, assuming that PMs are included as requested by CDPHE as part of their comments. I also support inclusion of this baseline information in the cumulative impacts plan. I generally agree with the suggested changes to the cumulative impacts plan that have been suggested by Conservation Colorado and WCA and other stakeholders, but may suggest the inclusion of the words impacted area. As a side note, in my opinion, the cumulative impacts plan is one of the most important tools within our rules to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. The structure for the cumulative impacts plan was developed in the mission change rulemaking, and I have previously cited references within the statement of basis and purpose that indicate what the expectations of the cumulative impacts plan are for the applicant. So I'll go on. But I want to note that for this commissioner, continuing to find paths towards electrification is an essential piece in evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts. And it would be my hope that in Rule 304C19D, which already indicates that it needs to include or that something that needs to be considered in there is barriers to electrification of a proposed oil and gas location, such as the result of any outreach an operator conducted to a utility about electrifying a site. That's from the statement of basis and purpose. I would like to see additional requirements to require an applicant to make a clear showing that they have made efforts towards electrification, including evidence of efforts, including evidence of those efforts. So generally, I agree with the suggested language for the purpose of the CDPHE consultation as provided by Conservation Colorado and WCA and some other stakeholders, and I feel it comports with the current expectations of the CDPHE consultation laid out in the statement of basis and purpose. The consultation process with our sister agencies, as well as federal agencies and local governments, is an essential piece to ensuring the rules we currently have and new rules that are being considered or implemented successfully. In many ways, our rules are a version of performance-based land use planning. In this process, the applicant bears the burden of proof in showing that the application that they have presented meets the requirements of the rules and the act and is protective and evaluates and addresses cumulative impacts. In this process, the commission in its review depends on the expertise of its professional staff, as well as the professional and expert opinions of CDPHE, CPW, federal agencies, and local governments. Having consistency in the consultation expectations and purposes throughout our rules, to me, is appropriate and essential to ensure we are properly reviewing applications and have the tools to determine whether or not the applicant has met the burden of proof to show that the application meets our rules and the act and is protective of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources, and evaluates and addresses cumulative impacts. I support the recommendations provided for modifications to the results of the consultation, which include review of the Form 2B for accuracy, inclusion of pollution emissions data and NOx intensity compliance, and would suggest the addition of CDPHE review of the cumulative impacts plan. I also support CDPHE's ability to recommend conditions of approval outside of negotiated BMPs they feel are necessary to ensure applications are protective. I also like the language suggested that better aligns the purposes of the consultation with CDPHE with those of CPW for consistency. I also generally agree with the suggestions provided for Rule 904, which includes sections for the NOx ozone season budget, Form 2s, and greenhouse gas sections. I think the process is laid out in their comment letter as relevance and applicability to this rulemaking. Similar suggestions for sector-wide annual determinations of compliance for both NOx and greenhouse gas reduction targets came from other stakeholders, which made similar requests. Determination of annual sector-wide compliance with NOx and greenhouse gas reduction expectations laid out in the governor's letter around NOx reduction need to be included in the draft rules, and outcomes for non-compliance with those sector-wide reduction targets need to have specific outcomes determined. I think throughout the stakeholder process and preparation for this cumulative impacts rulemaking, there has been feedback that more needs to be done to address impacts within disproportionately impacted communities. This message has been heard loud and clear by this commissioner. I appreciate that the rules include the updated definition of disproportionately impacted community. There's been a lot of comment and discussion regarding both in this process as well as in processes that have occurred at CDPHE about the utilization of the term and definition of cumulatively impacted community. While I understand the intent of trying to identify those areas in the state that are most impacted currently and to apply that information in permitting decisions, there have been clear challenges with appropriately defining the metrics as to what those areas clearly are. There seems to be less confusion with how disproportionately impacted communities are determined, and through the utilization of the accepted tool of EnviroScreen, cumulatively impacted communities are necessarily included in the definition of disproportionately impacted community. Understanding this, for me, is most logical to not utilize the term and definition of cumulatively impacted community, and rather focus on ways to evaluate and address cumulative impacts to disproportionately impacted communities. During the mission change rulemaking, we heard significant testimony and were provided countless studies and impacts associated with proximity of oil and gas locations to residents. Page 218 of the current statement of basis and purpose lays out a number of pages that develops those arguments and studies that provide a clear determination of what information and analysis the commission utilized to determine that a 2,000-foot setback was an appropriate distance to avoid potential impacts associated with oil and gas activities to residents. Understanding this rationale and finding that the rationale the rationale still holds true for this commissioner, it is clear that the best way to address cumulative impacts within disproportionately impacted communities is avoidance. As is indicated in the statement of basis and purpose, avoidance is the best tool available to address potential impacts. So therefore, it is my opinion that within disproportionately impacted communities, the draft rules should include a firm 2,000-foot setbacks from RBUs, high occupancy building units, schools, and childcare centers, with only informed consent as an off-ramp for RBUs. Distance is clearly the best tool available to us for addressing cumulative impacts in these areas that may be already experiencing cumulative impacts from a number of different sources. I would also propose removing preliminary siting associated with caps that contemplate locations within disproportionately impacted communities. I'm going to discuss briefly some additional elements as part of stakeholder comments that I'd like to discuss. I think CC4CA had some good suggestions around local government, including the CC4CA supports the inclusion of local governments, both relevant and proximate, as described throughout the process, and would suggest in Rule 302G also include data and information from either relevant or proximate local governments that would inform the cumulative impacts assessment. And number 2, request that Rule 304D be amended to, at the minimum, not consider any exemptions without prior consultation with the relevant and proximate local government. I think for Rule 311, I appreciate the revisions that occurred in the draft, but feel like there needs to be more clarity developed within this rule as to the expiration of Form 2As, Form 2s, and expectations for occupancy of sites proposed in OGDPs. These rules that attempt to evaluate and address cumulative impacts require specificity on when, where, and how an applicant intends to conduct operations. In addition, community members and local governments need clarity on when, where, and how operations are to be conducted to ensure that direct and cumulative impacts of these operations are evaluated and addressed. The timelines within Rule 11 need to be clear and enforceable, and loopholes that allow for undefined timelines and operations need to be addressed. I think the mitigation hierarchy is an essential tool within our existing rules and will be an essential in evaluating and addressing cumulative impacts in the proposed rules. I would ask that the draft rules be evaluated to ensure the mitigation hierarchy is emphasized within the appropriate section of the rules to ensure its applicability and utilization as an evaluative and addressing tool. Within the community outreach plan, I think it's an important tool, and I appreciate the revisions that were made, but would suggest modification of the plan to require that an applicant clearly make a showing on not only the outreach that was done, but how they intend to address the comments and concerns that were received as part of the community outreach efforts. I think many stakeholders made comments about the lack of clarity within the decision matrix in the NOx and greenhouse gas intensity sections. While it is clear to me staff's intent as expressed during the staff presentation last week, I think the language clarifying that intent might be appropriate. I appreciate Healthier Colorado's comments regarding outreach to local health boards for input and consultation, and think some consideration for how this could be incorporated within the rules makes sense, as local health boards and commissions can provide a perspective and information that could be important to hear in our proceedings. I think the Sierra Club makes some good recommendations for Rule 904I. I think Broomfield's recommendation for a certification by a company representative with oversight over the operator's NOx intensity program that, based on information and belief formed after reasonable inquiry, that an operator is in compliance with its NOx intensity target, could make sense. I know there's been some discussion that that could potentially limit the scope of this particular rulemaking, and I understand certainly the intent for that. I do think that Larimer County makes a good suggestion for a modification in the soil and reclamation aspects of the cumulative impacts evaluation and addressing that the interim and final reclamation success of each operator is currently available on the ECMC database under Reclamation Inspection Status Report, and that this information should be included in the site or database and be evaluated as part of the director's recommendation. I think Adams County makes a few good suggestions, and I think that their suggestion on changes associated with Rule 311 is a good one. I think that they also ask for additional consultation, or that the applicant's outreach is done via mailings and other direct method rather than only posted on the ECMC or external websites, and that the list of applicable residents, landowners, and tenants is verified prior to this engagement. That's a pretty standard county land use process. I think API and COGA made some good suggestions about potentially utilizing multiple community liaisons, and that RBUs should have the option of whether or not they're participating in the community outreach meetings and pre-application conferences. So in conclusion, and I apologize for the length of my comments, but I want to note that while I spent every waking hour over the last 2 days reviewing and trying to absorb the comments that were provided, I most certainly was not able to absorb, although I did read every comment that was provided. In my comments, I referenced a number of stakeholder comments, but clearly there were a number of themes that were included in many stakeholder comments that were similar. And by not including your comments by name does not mean that I did not read your thoughts. I also acknowledge that this is the beginning of a long process that will create many additional opportunities for stakeholder and community comment and engagement. And that as I continue down this process, I will reread and take more time to absorb the comments that have been provided previously, as well as the upcoming comments that will be provided. And I'm looking forward to working with you all in the upcoming process. So with that, Mr. Chair, that was my ridiculously long comment. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Messner, for the comments. Commissioner Ackerman, do you want to provide comments?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I will see your long comment and raise you a short comment. I appreciate Commissioner Messner. Certainly from my perspective, no apology necessary. I greatly appreciate that detailed approach and your significant insight, and I'm grateful that you shared it. Commissioner McGowan as well, I want to thank her for her considerable expertise on this issue and for helping shepherd us through what is certainly a complex issue and a complex process. And I would say that I agree with Commissioner McGowan's three-legged stool hierarchy. Specifically, I don't think wildlife should be an important part of this cumulative impacts process. As the commissioner who sits in the wildlife seat, I wanted to specifically comment on that issue. And I would state that the general sentiment is that we significantly addressed wildlife issues during Senate Bill 181 and the ensuing mission change rulemaking process, and that our wildlife regulations are generally working. By way of reminder, and for the cumulative impacts rulemaking record, I wanted to just mention some of those regulations. During that process, wildlife protection became a formal part of our mission. Consequently, we broadly strengthened and included wildlife protection throughout our regulations. We strengthened CPW's formal consultative role, and in some cases, we granted appropriate authority to that agency to consult, to recommend, to waive, to approve on certain wildlife-related issues. We also directed the systematic preparation of robust wildlife protection plans and wildlife mitigation plans on a project-by-project basis, and often on a larger than project-by-project basis. We strengthened the inclusion of improved wildlife best management practices as mandatory components of oil and gas development plans with specific regulatory authority behind them. We adopted high priority habitat maps and related rules that were intended to be updated annually to ensure we're working with the most updated information possible, resulting in significant protection for the most sensitive wildlife habitats in the state. We also included no surface occupancy provisions in some of the state's exceptionally sensitive habitat. We formalized the mitigation hierarchy and regulation. We created a formal wildlife compensatory mitigation program with a significantly funded habitat improvement component. We included wildlife habitat as a formal component of alternative location analyses and many other approaches. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to search for opportunities to continue to improve protections for wildlife, and specifically and especially to continue to seek to evaluate and address the cumulative impact of oil and gas development on wildlife going forward, and how we maintain connectivity and global health of wildlife habitat in the state. However, again, I would agree that modifications to wildlife regulations likely shouldn't be a key focus of this process going forward. I did want to make, I did want to make one specific comment on 301G3C, and which states that pre-application CPW consultation should occur if a development's within HPH. I would just clarify to make sure that that includes any part of a development. That would include, but be not limited to, well pads, access routes, staging areas, any other ground disturbance of a project related to high priority habitat or found within high priority habitat would trigger that requirement. Given the specificity of commissioners who have commented before me, I won't restate any other regulation-specific comments I had, as they and more have all been addressed. I will just reiterate a few global points that I think are important. I also do not wish to overlap or duplicate efforts from our sister agencies. They've been given specific jurisdiction, specific authority, and have specific expertise associated with their subject matter. But specifically, we should continue to work together and within the standards of those agencies and work together with them within their jurisdictions, and particularly where our jurisdictions cross paths. I also think the concept of addressable impacts is an important concept. I think a definition would be helpful. I think this concept should significantly inform the scope of our approach. I also keyed on the 1 mile within the definition, and I do think it's appropriate to have further discussion on the appropriate applicability of distance limitations with regard to ensuring an overall scope that is both appropriate and addressable. I wanted to also reiterate that I think proper data acquisition analysis is imperative and should inform the assessment of how we're doing with regard to addressing cumulative impacts. And that, note that various data gathering approaches and scopes may be necessary to accomplish those goals of assessing and addressing cumulative impacts. And I want to continue to encourage strengthening within our regulations the consultative roles of our sister agencies, especially CDPHE and CPW, within the scope of their expertise and jurisdiction, and highlight the importance of continuing to work collaboratively with local governments. I think that in our 181 rules, we charted a really great path, and the bill itself charted a really great path to working together with local governments. I think we have a lot of work to do to continue to foster that collaborative relationship, which has very different approaches, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I formally support working within our regulations to work in a flexible fashion with local jurisdictions. And, I wanted to also say that while we as a state, must continue to address cumulative, and I mean all impacts to the environment from all sources, I think it's imperative that we work within the scope of this commission. So to be clear on a specific point that has been mulling around in my mind and comes up from time to time, I wanted to specifically say I don't think it's appropriate if state policy that's tied to this rulemaking ultimately results in oil and gas continuing significant emissions reductions and continual improvements, while simultaneously adopting ECMC permitting rules that would effectively result in oil and gas development always getting the last bite of the cumulative emissions apple after all other emissions are considered. I think we have to be sensitive to that. As we do regulate oil and gas, we have to work within that scope, and that's the jurisdiction that we have. But I do think we have to be sensitive to the significant improvements that have gone on, that will continue to go on, and they might be disparate from approaches in other industries and other sectors that might continue to contribute to emissions. And we have to be careful about hamstringing future oil and gas development as we continue to reduce emissions within the scope, because and if overall emissions aren't continuing to be reduced. Now, that said, it's an important consideration, important factor, and we should have further discussion about it. But I do think we should be careful on that point. After all, I really do agree that this draft is a good starting point for a formal approach to continuing to work on the issue. I'm sensitive to Commissioner McGowan's comments to lead off this issue, that this is hard. And I know that the heart of a lot of people is in this issue, and I'm glad that it is. That's one of the great things about living in the state of Colorado. I continue to welcome considerable input and participation that we receive on this topic. And I, like Commissioner Messner, have reviewed all submissions and will continue to review all the draft comments, our draft language, and other materials associated with this process. And with that, Mr. Chair, I very much look forward to continuing to refine the state's ongoing, and I would reiterate, ongoing approach to cumulative impacts analysis.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Ackerman. Appreciate those comments. Commissioners Oath or Ray, do either of you desire to weigh in? Commissioner Arnold?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for those really thoughtful, really thorough comments and reviews. Really appreciate that. Want to say thank you to the team who worked on the draft rules. I would echo comments from the other commissioners of acknowledging that that is a tough task, and also again echo my appreciation for the collaborative work between our staffs on the drafting of the rules. That's, I think, been really important. CDPHE has submitted some comments on some specific issues, but I wanted to focus my comments kind of maybe from a more of a 10,000 foot view. I think it's important as I hear how other commissioners are approaching this, as I review public comments, to think about these rules in the scope, as a number of other commissioners have said, in the scope of all of the other work that is happening in terms of how do we address cumulative impacts here in this state. In particular, for me, I think there are, I'm hearing a couple of themes around what is the scope of a cumulative impact analysis in the scope of this process, but I think those conversations are happening otherwise, and I think they bear on each other. So I wanted to touch on that a bit, as well as the theme on thresholds or carrying capacity. And because CDPHE has two legislative proposals that we are moving forward on those in that space this session, then I just think it's important to keep in mind, if they are successful, thinking how might these rules fit in with the scope of that, as well as kind of sort of as we move forward, as a number of commissioners said, like this is a step, an additional step on addressing cumulative impacts, and it's not the last step either for this commission or for the state as a whole in addressing the cumulative impacts to communities. And so in terms of scope of cumulative impact analysis, I know been some comments about whether or not the straw dog is comprehensive, and what's appropriate in this space. So would just kind of, in my mind, share for context, coming out of the Environmental Justice Action Task Force recommendations, that task force grappled with how best to have a very comprehensive take on cumulative impact analyses. How do you or we consider the impact of air, water, waste, transportation, healthcare access, food scarcity, et cetera, right, in a particular decision? How do we have each agency do that on each permit application, or each operator do it, and what would that look like? And ultimately, the task force reached consensus that would result in a lot of inefficiency, duplication, and potential conflict. And so the ultimate recommendation from the task force was that the state approach this from a more holistic, community-based standpoint, and in understanding the cumulative burdens facing communities as a whole. And so there is a legislative proposal that we are moving forward in line with the task force's recommendations to develop cumulative impact analyses at a very high scale with a very broad scope. So we were asking, and it's our sense, based on the breadth of what the task force is recommending be included in such an analysis, that these could cost upwards of $1 million a piece. And so we're asking for a pretty significant investment of over $2 million for the development of at least 2 cumulative impact analyses to get us to begin this process of understanding from a very broad lens what are all of the cumulative burdens that impact a community. And then we also know that the development of those analyses will take some time, and that the next step after that is going to be, how do each of our respective agencies utilize such an analysis in decision making, right? And so I could see that down the line in the future, there would be 2 or more cumulative impact analyses with this very broad lens. We don't know yet where the first 2 would be done, or where we'd go next. And so they may or may not geographically cover all oil and gas development areas in the state, right? But those that do would be a really important tool for this commission to then revisit its rules and approach to how can we utilize that kind of comprehensive look at cumulative impacts on decisions in the future. So that's one piece I wanted to share. And then another, in terms of the conversations around how do we know if we've set, should a threshold be set? How do we set a threshold? How do we know when a community has hit too high of a burden and cannot withstand any additional pollution? That was certainly a conversation that the task force grappled with as well. We did not include any ultimate consensus-based recommendations on this, but as an outgrowth of that conversation, a second piece of our department's legislative proposal on cumulative impacts addresses this, and it would propose to create a program that would allow local governments to who feel that their community is experiencing cumulative impact burden to opt into like a program where they would be empowered to be able to basically implement just this. If they feel that their community has just maxed out on carrying capacity, and if a source is proposing to new or increased emissions of health-based pollutants, and this is very, the pollutants we've been looking at really are like benzene, hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide, NOx, and there is one more, particulate PM 2.5. Then if the source is proposing those pollutants within an area that's opted into and into this type of program, that local government could really basically say, we don't feel that that's appropriate for our community. We've hit this carrying capacity, and even if they could meet a particular air standard for PM or for benzene, given the overall burden that the community is facing in terms of air, water, et cetera, what have you, that the community just cannot bear that anymore. So that's pending. Certainly don't know, whether or not the General Assembly will pass that, but it is, I think, a potential important opportunity or option for communities in the future, which I think dovetails, and there's certainly interest that I'm hearing in the course of these conversations and then the comments that I have seen as well. And then I would want to echo a number of the commissioners who commented about just the importance of moving forward with rules that are very thoughtful in terms of the balance of our agency's respective authorities to ensure that we don't have duplication, that the processes really do dovetail and work together. I know our staff have worked very closely together on the straw dog to do that. There've been a lot of ideas in the stakeholder comments, as well as those that commissioners found to be worth looking into some more that would potentially impact that. And so I would just say that we would, as the agency, as if the staff is, if ECMC staff is going to be looking at changes, would really want to have ongoing conversations about that to make sure that, what we're looking at is meaningful and is feasible, and so and is not duplicative. And then I think the last comment I'd make is there were a number of comments about many other things that are happening in the space. Yes, CDPHE is, as Commissioner McGowan noted, has some work on our calendar for this year and the coming years with respect to identifying priority air toxics and ultimately establishing health-based standards, which will then be implemented into permits. And so we will be. And so that work is coming. We have established intensity standards for NOx and greenhouse gases. I heard one comment that when CDPHE establishes thresholds, and I want to be clear, like we will be setting those standards, not the type of, to me, I think those are as standards and thresholds more in this bucket of the legislative proposal that I was talking about, where you can really be considering cumulative impacts as a whole. So I wanted to just provide that context. And with that, those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Oath. I appreciate those comments. I appreciate that sort of the broader framework of what we're doing needs to nest and complement the work that your shop is doing, and highlights the importance of us needing to sort of cross-link without duplicating or impeding. I, as one commissioner, really rely on the expertise that your shop has in a lot of these areas. And so I'll have some more comments in a bit, but just wanted to emphasize the importance of having the CDPHE seat on this commission, as the legislature reflected back in 2019 under 19181, and continuing to have that voice. And so while we've got Commissioner McGowan to help us out on that front, it's always great to have you as well with us. So thank you very much for being with us today. Commissioner Ray, did you want to bring something to the table?
Thank you, Chair Robbins, and thank you all for participating in this conversation. It's really important. I will keep my comments brief. DNR believes that addressing cumulative impacts is a critical part of this commission's work, and we believe that this rulemaking will improve the state's approach to addressing those impacts. I just want to express my appreciation to ECMC staff for their work on the draft rules, and Treasurer Oath's staff at CDPHE for their collaboration. As Chair Robbins said, that collaboration is critically important. I also want to express appreciation for the quality and diversity of the comments that were submitted by all the interested stakeholders. They were very valuable in helping me understand both our proposal and how that's viewed by the stakeholders that are interested in this issue. So appreciate those. And last, I want to appreciate the substantive comments of my fellow commissioners. And I won't reiterate those points here, but it was really valuable to hear their perspectives. Finally, I'll just say that I look forward to the refinement of the draft rules for consideration by the commission, and expect that that will incorporate many of the perspectives that we've heard, both in comments that were made by stakeholders and in comments by the commissioner. So thank you again.
Thank you, Commissioner Ray. It's really cool to have all 7 commissioners weighing in on topic. I think it really does provide to our stakeholders the importance we all believe in, which is the cumulative impacts rulemaking. I've taken some notes as I went along of things that my fellow commissioners said, and all I'm going to do is try to provide kind of a thumbs up in areas in which I have some consensus, just so that the staff can understand where maybe we've got 2 or 3 or 4 commissioners thinking on the same lines. I really appreciated Commissioner McGowan going first. I agree with her 3 legs. I also agree that while the 4 other areas, HAPS, wildlife, produced water, and reclamation, are very important, I do not believe they are as important as is necessary for this second round of cumulative impacts rulemaking. And I want to go on record that we will address those areas in due time, but we have a mandate to get these rules done by the end of April. And so we need to focus on the other matters that are the 3-legged stool that Commissioner McGowan noted out. I agree that getting some form of baseline is a good idea. I'm not sure how to do it, as Commissioner McGowan agreed as well. I am not an advocate for those that are interested in requiring modeling before OGDPs and modeling at our state agency. I'm more of an advocate of us moving forward with the work we're doing, and then letting CDPHE do the work that they're doing. With regard to the 1 mile, I can see moving away from 1 mile, but I also like the consistency that it provides. And I get concerned that whenever we've got subjectivity, and that subjectivity gets defined by the operators, both operators and our other stakeholders get frustrated about that. So I don't have a good answer for staff, but I am interested in reviewing the geographic limits of cumulative impacts. Moving down, I agree that the word addressable is very important. I agree with the governor's letter of explanation and the signing statement. So I'll leave my comments on that point there. I'm in agreement, I think, with the idea of doing a little more with the community liaison. I think it's a good idea. With regard to NOx and greenhouse gas, I think that we've done a good job in the straw dog of initially approaching that. I agree that having a collaboration with CDPHE makes sense. The one thing that I disagree with, I believe that the rules that have been drafted are meeting the governor's directive for achieving significant NOx reductions from the oil and gas sector. What I don't support is creating an additional ozone season NOx budget on top of the governor's NOx targets. With all that, I do think staff should explore more directly stating in the rules that if an operator is not expected to meet or has not met its NOx intensity standard, that the commission may not be able to approve drilling for that operator during the ozone season. So that's some direction from me on that front. On grandfathering, I think that's a really critical component for us to think about. I also think about it in line with something that's not in the straw dog rules, but something that I think is an important concept. I have a concern that we do a not good job of addressing cumulative impacts when we approve an OGDP location. And when one well gets drilled, that location is vested in perpetuity for drilling of wells a long time down the road. I have a problem with that. We recently had to deal with this with regard to an OGDP. I have a problem with the fact that our rules have OGDPs vest forever if one well gets drilled, and I'd like staff to look at that. I think that giving an operator, say, 10 years until they drill the next wells, the cumulative impacts are going to be completely different. And I think we should address that by stopping the way that the draft is done there. That's a new topic that hasn't been discussed. I wanted to raise it early in the straw dog discussion so that it could be addressed by staff and by our stakeholders. So stakeholders, I'd love to hear from you on that topic. You know how to reach me. I agree with a lot of the comments from Commissioner Cross that addressable, the signing statement, don't try to overstate it and say we address everything. We regulate and address oil and gas impacts. I agree. I'm going down to Commissioner Ackerman. I agree with the statement you made there, and this is a segue to Commissioner Cross. We have made significant improvement in emission reductions for new permits. Because of this, I don't think it appropriate for if state policy results in oil and gas gets the last bite at the CI apple. I liked that comment, Commissioner Ackerman, and I think it tries to balance the protective work we do and our emissions permitting rules. Trying to achieve that balance, I think, is a really important place for us to work on. I agree, back to Commissioner Cross, I agree that our definition should not be a NEPA oriented. That is beyond our jurisdiction. I also, as I've mentioned before, we should not duplicate CDPHE, and that's particularly with regard to NOx and greenhouse gas. And Commissioner Messner, there was so much that you said that I'm not really penciled in on what parts I agree with or disagree with, but I thought you had a lot of good comments. And as I mentioned, Commissioner Oath, I really appreciate your bringing that perspective to the table. Let me see if I've got anything else. Oh, just as a little nit, with regard to the definite revising the definition of industrial manufacturing operations to say something like that include but are not limited to, so that we don't always just look at those two pieces, and that perhaps in certain instances the puzzle gets broader. Those are my collectively put together thoughts on that process. I would look to Director Murphy and Deputy Director Larson. We gave you a lot. Thankfully, there's a YouTube recording of this, and you and staff can go back and parse through things that were said. I think I've heard a lot of consensus on a lot of things. Where there's not consensus, and if there is not a plurality, but maybe two or more commissioners going one way on a topic and two or more commissioners going another way on a topic, I, as one commissioner, do not have a problem with vesting you with more homework to actually draft both ideas so that we can consider both topics and allow our stakeholders to consider both topics. I don't think I heard a lot of that from commissioners, but I just give you that direction from me as chair. I don't know if my other commissioners are comfortable with that. I would assume so, because it gives us a sort of a broader thing to look at. But having us all rambled on for 2+ hours now, anything further you want to hear from us, or are you good to go in terms of high-level direction? Director Murphy, Deputy Director Larson.
Happy to defer to Deputy Director Larson.
Thank you, Director, and thank you, Chair. Staff is very appreciative of the feedback, and as you stated, there was a lot of it, and it was all incredibly helpful. I think we have a lot for us to be able to take back, undertake a good revision to the rules, and be in a spot to get these still noticed with the Secretary of State within the timeline that we had outlined, which is sometime next week. Again, one of the reasons for the expedited timeline is so that we can ensure future parties to this rulemaking have sufficient time to fully participate in that process. I do just want to comment very briefly on Commissioner McGowan's requests as it relates to some of the accessibility requests, for instance, ensuring we have translations, services available at our public comment sessions, ensuring that the rules are also made available in Spanish, etc. Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. We most certainly will be able to incorporate that feedback and be able to provide those services and additional explanatory aids as we notice this rulemaking. So that's very helpful. I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that. And one last thing, thank you, Commissioner Oath, for your feedback, and we most certainly will continue to reach out and collaborate with your staff who, as we've noted more than once, have been incredibly helpful to us. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you, Deputy Director Larson. Unless commissioners have other thoughts, I think we've concluded this portion of our agenda for today, knowing full well that the next 2.5 months are going to be full up on cumulative impacts rulemaking. I will close it out by telling everybody that we really do appreciate all of our stakeholders' really thoughtful and considered input to this. It's a lot of work. In particular, for those of you who are doing this, on your own, we really appreciate it, and thank you for paying attention to this important topic for the state of Colorado. Commissioners, with that, I think the next best step is to take a break. The next agenda item has at least 25 or 30 minutes of presentation by the applicant. And then we're going to bump into a conflict with at least one commissioner with another duty at 1 o'clock. So if we come back at 1:15, does that work for everybody? Gives us approximately an hour, or an hour and 10 minutes. All right, then let's break until 1:15. Thank you.